the pitch-black silence of the king's chamber, there is a stillness so complete it feels less like absence and more like presence, an ancient awareness embedded in stone. The air is cool, dry, unmoving, as if the pyramid itself has been holding its breath for thousands of years. Above, narrow shafts pierce the immense weight of limestone, aligned with a precision that seems to defy time itself, pointing toward Orion, toward Sirius, toward the same celestial fires that once watched over the birth of Egyptian civilization. Nothing here feels accidental. Nothing here feels merely built. The geometry is too exact, the orientation too deliberate, the silence too intentional, and so the question rises slowly from the darkness, heavy as the structure that contains it. Are these just stones, or are they something far more profound? A machine carved from eternity itself, designed not to house the dead, but to guide them beyond death? Is this a tomb or a map, etched in limestone and shadow, pointing not across land, but across existence itself? Somewhere within this monumental silence lies the echo of a forgotten intelligence, one that may have understood the sky not as distant light, but as a structured order, a cosmic architecture bound to earth through alignment, mathematics, and myth. And beyond it all, stretching like an unseen spiral through time, there is the suggestion of a cycle so vast it dissolves ordinary history, the slow turning of a 26,000-year celestial wheel, where stars drift, return, and reshape the heavens above civilizations that rise and fall like dust beneath them. This is not simply a story of pyramids, it is a descent into the architecture of the eternal, a journey through stone, star, and silence, where history, myth, and astronomy blur into something older than memory itself. Leave the modern world behind. Step into the infinite past. There was a time before the first shadow of the pyramids stretched across the desert, a time before chisels rang against limestone, before ropes strained under the weight of carved stone, before names were etched into history with the stubborn certainty of kings. In that earlier silence, the plateau of Giza did not yet belong to memory. It lay untouched beneath the vast breathing sky, a long expanse of pale earth and ancient bedrock, where the wind moved slowly, as if reluctant to disturb something sacred. The desert did not roar, it whispered, soft grains of sand drifting over stone, brushing against the surface of the land like fingertips tracing something half forgotten. The night was the truest version of this place. When the sun surrendered its dominion, the heat did not vanish at once. It lingered, rising in wavering currents from the ground, distorting the last light until the horizon itself seemed to dissolve. And then, gradually, the air cooled. The earth exhaled. What had been harsh and blinding softened into something vast, something almost tender. Darkness unfolded not as a curtain, but as a slow deepening, a blue that thickened into black, revealing, one by one, the distant fires of the sky. Above the plateau, the stars emerged, not scattered, not random, but deliberate, sharp and watchful, arranged in patterns that seemed too precise to be accidental. They burned with a cold steadiness, untouched by wind or time. The sky was not empty, it was inhabited, alive with silent presences that neither flickered nor faded. And somewhere within that immense stillness, human eyes were watching. They stood barefoot upon the cooling stone, their feet familiar with every contour of the land. The ground beneath them was not merely earth, it was foundation, enduring, unmoving, older than memory itself. The plateau rose slightly above the surrounding valley, as though it had been lifted, chosen, set apart for a purpose that had not yet been spoken aloud. The watchers did not speak. Words, here, would have felt intrusive, too small for what unfolded above them. Instead, they lifted their gaze. The sky stretched without boundary. No walls, no roofs, no edges to contain it. Only depth, immeasurable and endless. And within that depth, certain stars seemed to call more loudly than others, 3 of them in particular. They did not blaze with the brilliance of the brightest star, nor did they dominate the sky with overwhelming light. Instead, they held a quieter authority, aligned, almost in a line, but not perfectly so. A subtle shift, a slight offset, as though one had stepped just a little aside from the others. It was not obvious, It required patience to see. The watchers stood for long stretches of time, unmoving, letting their eyes adjust, letting the patterns reveal themselves slowly. They traced invisible lines between the stars, mapping relationships that existed only in perception, but felt no less real for it. The desert around them remained still, no voices, no footsteps, only the faint stirring of wind carrying the scent of dry stone and distant water from the unseen Nile. Occasionally, a grain of sand would shift, skittering softly across the surface, a quiet reminder that even in stillness, the world was never entirely at rest, and yet something had begun, not in the land, but in the mind. A question, at first, not spoken, not even fully formed, more like a sensation, a recognition that what lay above might not be separate from what lay below, that the sky was not simply something to observe, but something to understand, to interpret, perhaps even to answer. The watchers lowered their gaze, slowly, reluctantly, as though pulling themselves away from something magnetic. The ground waited, rough, solid, silent. What if, though the thought came gently, almost hesitantly, what if the patterns above could be brought down, not in light, but in form, not in fire, but in stone? The idea did not arrive all at once. It unfolded in layers, like the night itself. At first, it was nothing more than a comparison, the alignment of stars mirrored in the arrangement of imagined points upon the ground, a mental exercise, a curiosity. But curiosity, once awakened, does not easily return to sleep. They began to mark the earth, not with tools, not yet, but with movement, steps measured against the land, distances paced out beneath the open sky. One point, then another, then a third, offset slightly, just as it appeared above. They would pause, look up, adjust, look down, correct. The process was slow, repetitive, almost meditative. Time lost its sharp edges. Minutes stretched into hours, hours into nights. The watchers returned again and again, guided not by urgency, but by something quieter, a pull that did not demand, but invited. Above them, the stars remained constant. They did not drift wildly across the sky, nor did they vanish without reason. Night after night, they returned to their places, tracing arcs so gradual they could only be noticed over long spans of time. There was order here, a rhythm, a pattern that suggested intention, and the watchers began to feel it, not as knowledge, but as certainty. The sky was not chaotic. It was structured. And if it was structured, then perhaps it could be understood. And if it could be understood, perhaps it could be recreated. The idea took root, not as a declaration, but as a quiet agreement between those who stood beneath the stars. No single voice claimed it. No single moment marked its birth. It grew organically, shaped by observation, by repetition, by the slow accumulation of insight. They began to imagine something larger, not just points upon the ground, but forms, rising structures that could anchor these celestial patterns in the physical world. Shapes that would endure beyond the fleeting nature of human life. Shapes that would not fade with memory, but remain fixed and unwavering, just as the stars themselves appeared to be. Triangles, simple at first glance, but when lifted upward, when extended into 3 dimensions, they became something more, stable, balanced, pointing, always pointing, toward the sky. The wind moved again, brushing against their garments, carrying fine dust that settled into the folds of cloth and the lines of skin. It coated their hands, their arms, their faces, as if the land itself were marking them, claiming them as participants in something yet to be fully realized. They did not resist. They stood within it, breathing slowly, listening, not with their ears, but with something deeper, something more intuitive. The desert was not empty. It held memory, not in words or images, but in presence, a sense that what they were beginning had, in some way, always been waiting to begin. The first line was not drawn with a tool. It was drawn in thought, a connection between sky and earth, between what was seen and what could be made, and once that line existed, even invisibly, it could not be undone. The watchers looked upward again. The 3 stars remained, unwavering in their quiet alignment. But now, they were no longer distant points of light. They were a blueprint, a whisper of instruction, a suggestion that the boundary between heaven and earth was not fixed, but permeable, that what existed above could, with enough patience, enough precision, enough devotion, be brought below. The night deepened. The stars burned on, and somewhere, within the stillness of the Giza plateau, before a single stone had been carved, before a single block had been set into place, the first decision was made, not announced, not recorded, but understood. They would build, not merely to honor the earth, but to answer the sky. And as the watchers stood in silence, their eyes moving between the heavens and the waiting ground, one question lingered, unspoken, yet impossible to ignore. Who first taught them to look upward and see not just stars, but instructions? The question did not arrive with urgency. It unfolded slowly, like the first pale light stretching across the horizon. Subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, and then, gradually, impossible to ignore. Who built them? The plateau no longer belonged to silence alone. Where once there had been only wind and starlight, there were now interruptions, lines that had not existed before, surfaces that caught the light differently, edges that resisted the soft erosion of time. The ground, once continuous, had begun to fracture into intention. And yet, even as the first signs of design emerged, the presence of those who shaped it remained strangely indistinct. They were there, they had to be, but the land did not hold their likeness the way it would hold the stones. No faces remained pressed into its memory, no voices lingered in the air, only the result of their actions, precise, deliberate, and quietly defiant of explanation. The work began not with grandeur, but with repetition. A single strike against stone, then another, then another. The sound did not echo loudly. It was absorbed by the open air, softened by distance, carried away by the wind before it could gather into anything resembling noise. Up close, it was sharp, a clean fracture, a decisive separation, but from afar, it dissolved into something almost rhythmic, a pulse. Stone yielding to intention. The bedrock of the plateau was not easily persuaded. It resisted, not violently, not dramatically, but with a quiet, unyielding firmness. Each cut required patience. Each surface demanded attention. There was no rushing the process, no forcing the earth to comply. And yet, it did, gradually, reluctantly, precisely. Blocks began to emerge, not as chaotic fragments, but as forms already imagined before they were revealed. Their edges were not guessed, they were determined. Their dimensions did not vary wildly, they conformed, again and again and again. The watchers, no longer only observers but participants, moved with a kind of restrained discipline. Their movements were economical, almost ritualistic. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary gesture. They measured constantly, lengths traced by cords pulled taut between fixed points, angles checked, then checked again, surfaces smoothed not until they appeared flat, but until they were, to a degree that resisted casual perception. The eye might accept approximation, but they did not. The air carried the scent of stone dust, dry, faintly metallic, settling into the lungs with each breath. It clung to skin, to fabric, to hair, coating everything in a fine, pale layer that blurred the boundary between human and earth. Time began to change. Days were no longer counted in sunrises and sunsets, but in repetitions of action, in the steady accumulation of effort, in the gradual transformation of the plateau from something natural into something deliberate. And still, the question remained. Who built them? Were they merely laborers responding to instruction, or were they something else entirely, participants in a knowledge that extended beyond individual understanding? The distinction was not clear because what began to take shape upon the plateau did not resemble the work of hands alone. It suggested something deeper, something organized. The base of the first structure did not wander. It did not drift slightly off course, corrected later through compromise. It was set, aligned with a certainty that felt almost unnatural. The edges stretched outward, meeting the cardinal directions with an accuracy that seemed to anticipate tools not yet imagined. North, south, east, west, the lines held, not approximately, not symbolically, but exactly, so exact that even time, with all its erosion and shifting, struggled to distort it. The watchers did not celebrate this. They did not pause to admire their achievement. They continued, because the alignment was not the goal, it was the beginning. The blocks grew larger. What had once been manageable fragments became massive forms, each requiring coordination beyond a single pair of hands. They were lifted, moved, positioned with a care that bordered on reverence. The ground trembled slightly under their weight, not violently, but perceptibly, as though acknowledging the introduction of something immense. The sound of movement changed, no longer the sharp strike of chisel against stone, but the low, sustained friction of weight sliding across surface, a deep, almost inaudible groan that resonated through the ground more than through the air. Ropes tightened, bodies leaned, the motion was slow, deliberate, and yet, despite the scale, despite the weight, despite the inherent resistance of matter itself, the placement was exact. Edges met edges without visible gap. Surfaces aligned without visible deviation. Corners formed angles that did not drift, did not soften, did not betray uncertainty. It was here, within these moments, that the uncanny began to emerge, not in spectacle, but in consistency, because precision, once achieved, can be dismissed as skill. But precision, repeated without deviation, becomes something else, something that resists simple explanation. The watchers moved among the rising forms, their presence becoming less distinct as the structures grew. The stone began to dominate the landscape, altering not only its appearance, but its atmosphere. Shadows formed where none had existed before, long, angular, shifting slowly with the movement of the sun. The plateau was changing, not just physically, but perceptually. It began to feel constructed, as though the land itself had been persuaded to adopt a new identity. And still, the work continued, layer upon layer, course upon course, each new addition resting upon the one below with a stability that seemed almost inevitable. There was no visible struggle to maintain balance, no sense that collapse was a risk narrowly avoided. The structure rose as though it knew how to stand. The angle of its sides did not waver. It held, consistent from base to peak, narrowing gradually, predictably, forming a shape that seemed both simple and impossibly refined. A triangle, lifted into 3 dimensions, pointing upward, always upward. The sun passed overhead, day after day, tracing its arc across the sky. Its light struck the stone differently as the structure grew, catching edges, casting shadows, revealing textures that shifted with the angle of illumination. At dawn, the surfaces glowed faintly, absorbing the first light like a memory. At midday, they blazed, bright, almost blinding, reflecting the intensity of the sun with a stark, uncompromising brilliance. At dusk, they softened, their edges dissolving into shadow, their forms becoming less distinct, as though retreating back into the earth from which they had emerged. And at night, they returned to the stars. The alignment, once imagined, once marked upon the ground, began to assert itself in a new way, no longer abstract, no longer conceptual, physical. The positions of the structures mirrored the pattern above, not perfectly symmetrical, but faithfully offset, the slight deviation preserved, the imbalance maintained. A decision made long before the first stone was placed, now made visible. The watchers stood among the rising forms, their gaze moving once more between sky and earth. But something had changed. Before, they had looked upward for guidance. Now, they could look around them. The pattern existed in both realms, above and below. The boundary between the two felt thinner now, less absolute, as though the act of replication had created a connection, a correspondence that allowed one to reflect the other. And yet, the question deepened. Who built them? Because what stood upon the plateau did not feel like the work of individuals. It felt inevitable, as though it had always existed in potential, waiting only for the right moment, the right alignment of knowledge and intention, to become real. The watchers aged. Though time was difficult to measure, it could not be denied. Movements slowed slightly. Gestures became more deliberate. New figures appeared among them, taking up the same actions, repeating the same processes, continuing the same work without interruption. The knowledge did not vanish, it transferred, quietly, seamlessly, as though it belonged not to a single generation, but to something larger, something that persisted beyond individual lives. The structures continued to rise, higher, sharper, more defined. Their surfaces grew smoother, their edges more precise, their presence more commanding. They did not blend into the landscape, they transformed it. The plateau, once open and undefined, now revolved around them. They became its center, its focus, its reason, and still there were no inscriptions, no declarations carved into the stone to explain their purpose, no signatures left behind to claim authorship. Only form, only alignment, only the quiet insistence of precision. The wind moved across the plateau, brushing against the surfaces of the structures, producing a faint, almost inaudible sound, a soft, continuous whisper that seemed to circle the stone, tracing its edges, exploring its angles. It did not disturb them, it acknowledged them, as though even the air had begun to adapt to their presence. Night fell again. The stars returned. The 3 points in the sky, unchanged, unwavering, looked down upon their counterparts below. The correspondence was complete, or nearly complete, because something remained unresolved. A subtle tension, a question that had not yet found its answer. The watchers stood at the base of the rising forms, their shadows stretching long across the stone in the faint light of the stars. They looked upward, then downward, then upward again. The alignment was precise. The structure was stable. The pattern was faithful. And yet there was a sense, quiet, persistent, that something essential had not yet been revealed. That the act of building, no matter how exact, no matter how devoted, was only part of a larger intention. The stone stood silent. The stars burned on, and somewhere between them, hidden not in what had been created, but in how it had been conceived, the true nature of the architects remained just out of reach, not absent, not unknowable, but waiting for those who would look closer and begin to ask not just who built them, but how they knew where to begin. The stone did not speak, and yet standing within its presence, beneath the weight of its silence, beneath the slow drift of starlight across its surfaces, it began to feel as though it remembered something, not in words, not in symbols, but in alignment. The question from before did not disappear. It deepened, like a shadow lengthening at dusk. How did they know where to begin? The plateau held its answer in stillness. The structures stood where they had been placed, unchanged, unyielding, their edges catching the faint silver of the night. The desert had quieted once more. The sounds of labor, of friction, of measured movement had long since faded, leaving behind only the soft, continuous breath of wind moving across stone. Above, the sky opened, not abruptly, not dramatically, but gradually, as it always had. The last warmth of the day withdrew from the ground, retreating into memory. The air cooled, the horizon softened, and then, one by one, the stars returned. First faint, then certain, then innumerable. They spread across the darkness like a map that had never been drawn, only discovered. The watchers, though fewer now, though changed by time, still lifted their gaze. It was no longer an act of searching, but of recognition. What had once been distant, mysterious, and undefined had become familiar, not in the sense of being understood completely, but in the way something vast becomes intimate through repetition. The sky was no longer separate. It was connected. The 3 structures on the plateau, rising from the earth with their quiet, geometric certainty, stood in relation to one another exactly as they had been placed. Not equidistant, not symmetrical, but offset, subtly, deliberately. The same quiet deviation that had once resisted translation from sky to earth now existed in stone. And above them, the 3 stars. They hung in the darkness, unwavering in their arrangement, not identical in brightness, not perfectly aligned, one slightly displaced, just enough to disturb perfection, just enough to make the pattern unmistakably real. The correspondence was not forced, it revealed itself. The watchers did not need to draw lines in the sand anymore. They did not need to pace distances or adjust positions. The pattern had moved beyond abstraction. It existed, fully formed, in both realms, above and below. The mind, once occupied with measurement and construction, began to shift into something quieter, more receptive. The effort had ended, the structure remained, and now there was only observation. The night deepened, the stars intensified, the air grew still, carrying a faint chill that settled gently against the skin. The desert no longer felt harsh, it felt vast, open, receptive, almost infinite in its stillness. Moonlight, when it came, did not flood the land. It revealed it. A pale, diffused glow spread across the plateau, touching the edges of the pyramids, tracing their lines with soft illumination. The stone absorbed the light differently than the sand. Where the desert reflected faintly, the structures seemed to hold it, gathering it along their surfaces, giving them a presence that felt both solid and ethereal. They did not disappear into the night. They emerged from it. Their sides caught the moonlight in gradients, one face glowing faintly, another falling into shadow, the third dissolving into darkness entirely. The edges, sharp and unwavering, cut clean lines against the sky, pointing upward with quiet insistence, and beyond them, the stars. The three stars. The watchers began to see what had always been there, but had never felt so immediate. The pattern was not coincidence, it was correspondence. The placement of the pyramids did not merely resemble the stars, it echoed them. The distances, though scaled, held proportion. The offset, though translated into stone, preserved its subtle deviation. The orientation aligned not just with the ground, but with the movement of the heavens themselves. It was not a symbol, it was a reflection. The idea settled slowly, like dust returning to rest after a long disturbance. The earth had been arranged to mirror the sky, not loosely, not metaphorically, but intentionally. The watchers stood among the structures, their gaze moving between the two realms, and something within them shifted, something that had been forming quietly, patiently, throughout the long process of observation and construction. The boundary between above and below began to dissolve, not physically, but perceptually. The sky no longer felt distant. It did not feel unreachable, or separate, or beyond the limits of the human world. It felt continuous, as though the same order that governed the stars extended downward, into the earth, into the stone, into the very act of building. The pyramids were not intrusions upon the landscape. They were translations. The desert held its silence. The wind moved softly, brushing against the stone, carrying faint currents of cool air that slipped along the surfaces, tracing the angles, following the lines upward before dispersing into the open sky. The stars did not flicker. They burned steadily, their light traveling across unimaginable distances, arriving without distortion, without hesitation. And yet, here they were, reflected, anchored, given form. The watchers began to understand something that could not be easily spoken. The act of building had not been an imposition upon the earth. It had been an act of listening. The sky had offered a pattern, and the earth had answered. The three pyramids stood in their positions, unchanging, unwavering, holding the alignment with a certainty that resisted doubt. They did not drift. They did not shift. They remained, fixed points within a landscape that would otherwise change with time. And above them, the stars continued their slow, deliberate movement. It was not a symbol. It was a reflection. The idea settled slowly, like dust returning to rest after a long disturbance. The earth had been arranged to mirror the sky, not loosely, not metaphorically, but intentionally. The watchers stood among the structures, their gaze moving between the two realms, and something within them shifted, something that had been forming quietly, patiently, throughout the long process of observation and construction. The boundary between above and below began to dissolve, Not physically, but perceptually. The sky no longer felt distant. It did not feel unreachable or separate or beyond the limits of the human world. It felt continuous, as though the same order that governed the stars extended downward, into the earth, into the stone, into the very act of building. The pyramids were not intrusions upon the landscape. They were translations. The desert held its silence. The wind moved softly, brushing against the stone, carrying faint currents of cool air that slipped along the surfaces, tracing the angles, following the lines upward, before dispersing into the open sky. The stars did not flicker. They burned steadily, their light traveling across unimaginable distances, arriving without distortion, without hesitation. And yet, here they were, reflected, anchored, given form. The watchers began to understand something that could not be easily spoken. The act of building had not been an imposition upon the earth. It had been an act of listening. The sky had offered a pattern, and the earth had answered. The three pyramids stood in their positions, unchanging, unwavering, holding the alignment with a certainty that resisted doubt. They did not drift. They did not shift. They remained, fixed points within a landscape that would otherwise change with time. And above them, the stars continued their slow, deliberate movement. Burada kaldim, tu, kaldığım yerden, son yapıldı. Night after night, they rose. Night after night, they crossed the sky. Night after night, they returned. But not exactly. There was a difference. Subtle, gradual, almost imperceptible. The watchers noticed it. Not at first, not immediately, but over time. The alignment, the precise correspondence between sky and earth, shifted slightly. The stars no longer occupied the exact same positions relative to the horizon as they had before. The pattern remained, but its placement within the sky began to drift. The realization did not disturb them. It deepened the mystery. The pyramids did not move. They held the pattern as it had been, a moment, preserved, fixed in stone, while the sky continued. The idea unfolded slowly, like a thought too large to grasp all at once. The alignment was not eternal. It belonged to a specific time, a specific configuration of the heavens, a moment when the relationship between those three stars and the horizon, the cardinal directions, the position of the earth itself, aligned in a way that could be captured, and that moment had been chosen. The watchers stood within the stillness, their presence now quieter than ever, as though the act of understanding had reduced the need for movement, for action, for intervention. The structures had been built, the pattern had been mirrored, and yet the question expanded. Why this moment? The stars above were countless. The sky offered endless patterns, endless configurations, endless possibilities for interpretation. And yet, only this one had been chosen. Only this arrangement had been translated into stone. The wind shifted direction slightly, carrying with it the faintest trace of distant moisture from the unseen Nile. The air felt different for a moment, softer, almost alive with subtle change, before returning to its dry stillness. The pyramids stood unaffected. They did not respond. They did not adapt. They simply remained. Their presence, in that moment, felt less like construction and more like memory, as though they were not only reflecting the sky as it had been, but preserving it, holding it in place, allowing it to exist beyond the moment that had given rise to it. The watchers lowered their gaze. The ground beneath their feet felt solid, certain, unchanging, and yet they knew now it was not separate from the sky. The same order, the same pattern, the same quiet precision. The act of building had not bridged the gap between two worlds. It had revealed that there had never been a gap to begin with. Above, below, they were expressions of the same design. The night stretched onward. The stars continued their silent motion. The pyramids held their form. And somewhere within the vast stillness of the Saharan sky, the pattern that had once been distant, abstract and unknowable, now existed twice, once in light and once in stone. But as the watchers stood within that quiet symmetry, another thought began to emerge, slowly, almost reluctantly. If the pyramids were not merely aligned with the stars, but modeled after them, Then perhaps the builders were not simply observing the sky, but following something far older than themselves, something that had already decided where everything should be. The alignment alone was not enough. Stone could mirror the heavens with astonishing precision. Distances could be measured. Angles could be preserved. The earth itself could be persuaded into correspondence with the stars above. But geometry, by itself, could not explain devotion. It could not explain why generations of hands would labor beneath the crushing brightness of the Egyptian sun, why priests would stand through endless nights tracking the passage of certain stars with unwavering attention, why entire monuments would rise from the desert floor simply to preserve a celestial arrangement that, to many eyes, appeared silent and cold. No, something deeper moved beneath the alignment, something sacred. The desert knew it long before language did. At night, when the winds softened and the heat retreated from the stones, the plateau transformed into something almost unrecognizable. What appeared barren beneath daylight became immense beneath darkness, not empty, but consecrated. The sands no longer resembled wasteland. They resembled still water. Moonlight spread across the dunes in pale silver currents, smoothing their contours into soft waves of light and shadow. The plateau floated within the darkness like an island suspended between worlds. Above it stretched the celestial dome, vast, black, and impossibly alive. The stars no longer seemed distant. They watched. They pulsed faintly in the deep cold of the sky, their light steady but not lifeless. Some burned softly, others shimmered with a strange intensity, as though breathing through the darkness. And among them, Orion. The constellation rose slowly above the horizon, not all at once, but piece by piece. First one star, trembling faintly above the earth, then another, then the unmistakable line of the belt emerging from the darkness like 3 silver embers suspended in eternity. The priests waited for this moment. They stood upon the plateau, wrapped in linen robes that shifted softly in the desert wind. Torches burned nearby, their flames bending and recovering in rhythmic motion, releasing thin spirals of smoke into the cooling night air. The smell of sacred oils lingered around them, myrrh, cedar, frankincense. The fragrances mingled with the dry scent of stone and sand, creating an atmosphere that felt suspended outside ordinary time. The oils clung to skin and fabric alike, warmed gently by the torchlight, their sweetness drifting slowly across the open air. No voices rose above a whisper. The night itself seemed to demand restraint. The priests lifted their eyes toward Orion as it climbed higher into the heavens. Firelight reflected faintly in their pupils, flickering gold against the darkness, but their attention remained fixed upon the stars, not merely because Orion was beautiful, but because Orion was alive, or rather, because Orion was Osiris. The great god of death, rebirth, and eternal continuity did not dwell beneath the earth in darkness alone. He existed above, among the stars, woven into the heavens themselves. The constellation was not symbolic in the modern sense, not a metaphor, not an artistic interpretation imposed upon random lights. To the ancient Egyptian mind, the distinction scarcely existed. The stars were divine. Their movements carried intention. Their positions reflected order. Their eternal return across the sky revealed a truth deeper than mortal life, that death itself could become cyclical, rhythmic, enduring. And Osiris embodied that promise. The story had been whispered for generations beside temple walls and sacred fires. Osiris, the betrayed king, the dismembered god, the lord who descended into death and yet did not vanish. Through restoration, through sacred rites, through divine continuity, he rose again, not as ruler of the living world, but as sovereign of eternity itself. His kingdom was not beneath the sand. It was beyond it, above it, among the stars. The priests watched Orion ascend toward the meridian, its silver outline sharpening against the darkness as the night deepened. The constellation seemed almost impossibly deliberate, its form stretching across the heavens with quiet authority. The belt held the eye first, always the belt. 3 stars, perfectly imperfect, the same celestial arrangement mirrored upon the plateau below. But now the alignment carried meaning beyond mathematics. The reflection between sky and earth was not simply architectural, it was spiritual. The pyramids did not imitate the stars merely to honor them. They formed a pathway, a bridge, a vertical road for the soul. The idea moved through Egyptian belief with astonishing gentleness. Death was not imagined as annihilation, nor even as disappearance. It was transition, ascension, a movement upward through layers of existence toward divine permanence. The pharaoh, upon death, did not remain imprisoned within the tomb. The tomb was preparation. The body was preparation. Even the pyramid itself was preparation. The true destination lay beyond stone, beyond earth, within the stars of Orion. The torches crackled softly in the night wind. Their flames illuminated the edges of ceremonial vessels resting upon the ground beside the priests, bowls of oil, carved obsidian instruments, linen wrappings folded with impossible precision. The rituals unfolded slowly, nothing abrupt, nothing hurried. One priest poured oil into a shallow stone basin. Another raised incense toward the sky, allowing the smoke to rise in pale ribbons toward Orion itself. The scent thickened briefly, sweet and resinous, drifting upward until it dissolved into the cold desert air. The stars remained visible through the smoke, unreachable, and yet intimately near. The priests tracked Orion's movement carefully. Their eyes had learnt the pace of the heavens over decades of observation. They knew where the constellation would rise, where it would culminate, where it would descend. They understood the rhythm not merely as astronomy, but as sacred choreography. The sky performed, and the earth responded. The pyramids stood silent beneath Orion's ascent, their pale surfaces reflecting faint moonlight. In the darkness, they resembled enormous shadows carved from silver and stone, immovable against the shifting currents of time. The alignment between pyramid and constellation now felt less like design and more like destiny. As above, so below. The phrase had not yet been spoken in those exact words, but the principle already lived within the architecture of belief itself. The heavens and the earth were not isolated realms. They reflected one another continuously. What existed above shaped what unfolded below, and what was built below could answer the heavens in return. The pharaoh understood this, or perhaps more accurately, the pharaoh was required to embody it. His death was never purely personal. It was cosmic, a transformation that carried consequences beyond the mortal world. Through sacred rites and celestial alignment, the king became more than human memory. He became stellar. The soul ascending toward Orion was not imagined as drifting vaguely upward into endless darkness. The journey possessed structure, direction, intention. The stars formed destinations, specific ones, sacred coordinates within eternity, and Orion, Osiris, waited among them. The haunting beauty of this belief rested not in fearlessness toward death, but in intimacy with it. Death was not denied. The Egyptians understood its inevitability with profound clarity. Bodies decayed, kingdoms faded, rivers shifted course, dynasties dissolved into dust, but the stars remained, night after night, century after century, the same lights returning above the desert in unwavering rhythm. And so the human soul, fragile and temporary though it seemed, sought participation in that permanence. To join Orion was to escape forgetting, to become part of the eternal sky itself. The priests stood motionless as the constellation reached its highest point. The torches flickered lower now, their flames shrinking into softer gold. The desert air had grown colder. Fine grains of sand moved gently across the plateau, whispering against stone with delicate persistence. Above them, Orion dominated the heavens. The hunter, the king, Osiris. Its stars no longer resembled distant suns burning across incomprehensible distances. They resembled openings, small silver wounds in the fabric of night through which eternity itself watched the earth. The priests lowered their heads briefly in reverence, not submission, recognition, because beneath the immense celestial dome, surrounded by the scent of oils and incense, with the pyramids aligned beneath the silver heart of Orion, the distinction between mortal life and cosmic order seemed impossibly thin. The plateau itself felt transformed, not construction, not landscape, temple, an open sanctuary beneath the breathing heavens. Even the silence had changed. It no longer felt empty, it felt inhabited. The stars pulsed overhead with quiet intention, and the pyramids answered them without words, their geometry preserving the sacred relationship across generations that had not yet been born. The pharaoh's soul would ascend through this alignment, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but truly. The shafts within the pyramid, the orientation of chambers, the celestial positioning of the structures themselves, all of it formed part of a sacred mechanism aimed not toward earthly power, but toward transcendence, toward Orion. The idea settled over the plateau, like the cooling night itself. The pyramids were never meant merely to preserve the dead, they were designed to release them. And as Orion crossed slowly above the desert, pouring its ancient silver light upon the stones below, another realization emerged, quietly, almost imperceptibly. If the pharaoh's soul journeyed upward toward the stars, then perhaps the pyramids were never tombs at all, but gateways. The pyramid did not reveal itself willingly. From the outside, it appeared absolute, sealed within its own immense geometry, its smooth intentions buried beneath millions of tons of stone. Its silence seemed complete, final, as though whatever sacred purpose had once lived within it had long since withdrawn into darkness. And yet, hidden deep inside the Great Pyramid, beyond the ascending passages and narrow corridors, beyond the granite chambers where air itself seemed reluctant to move, there existed something strangely delicate, small openings, thin shafts cut through stone with astonishing precision, not large enough for a human body, not practical as passageways, not useful as ventilation in the ordinary sense. They were too narrow, too intentional, too exact, and they pointed somewhere, far above the king's chamber. The weight of the pyramid pressed downward with unimaginable force. Layer upon layer of limestone and granite rested in silence overhead, compressing the air itself into stillness. The stone did not creak, it did not shift, it simply endured, motionless beneath the slow drift of centuries. Inside, the air felt ancient, cool, dry beyond dryness itself, the kind of dryness that carried no scent of life, no trace of moisture, only the mineral stillness of sealed stone. Breathing within the pyramid felt different, as though the lungs instinctively understood they had entered a place where time moved more slowly. Even sound behaved differently here. A whisper did not travel far. It dissolved almost immediately into the surrounding mass of stone. Footsteps softened against the ancient floor, stripped of sharpness by the oppressive quiet. The deeper one moved into the structure, the more complete the silence became. Not empty silence, heavy silence, the kind that presses gently against the ears until the body begins to hear itself instead. The rhythm of breath, the pulse beneath the skin, the faint movement of fabric against stone. And within that immense stillness, the shafts waited. The entrance to one of them opened high along the chamber wall, dark and impossibly narrow. At first glance, it barely seemed real, merely a slit in the stone, a fracture, a shadow mistaken for depth. But it continued, straight, relentless, vanishing upward into darkness. The ancient builders had carved these shafts with extraordinary care. Their angles were not approximate, they were measured with an exactness that bordered on obsession. Each degree mattered, each subtle inclination carried intention, because these passages were not aimed randomly into the heavens. They targeted stars. The southern shaft of the king's chamber, aligned toward Orion's belt, toward Osiris, toward the eternal hunter waiting in the celestial darkness beyond the earth. And another shaft, silent, narrow, equally precise, angled towards Sirius, the radiant star associated with Isis, divine companion of Osiris, and luminous herald of rebirth. The pyramid, it seemed, was not closed at all. It was connected. Thin channels stretched from the hidden interior of the monument outward toward specific points in the night sky, as though the stone itself had been pierced by beams of invisible light. The sensation of standing before one of these shafts was deeply unsettling. The chamber surrounding it felt crushingly enclosed. Granite walls rose heavy and immovable on every side. The ceiling hung overhead with unbearable weight, millions of tons of stone pressed downward from above, sealing the chamber within the heart of the pyramid. like a fossil trapped in the earth. And yet, within that suffocating stillness, the shaft opened, a path, needle-thin, leading upward toward infinity. The contrast felt almost impossible to reconcile. Claustrophobia and vastness existing simultaneously. The body felt buried, but the soul felt aimed. The priests who entered these chambers understood this tension intimately. They carried small oil lamps into the darkness, their flames trembling faintly in the still air. The light they produced was weak and golden, barely enough to illuminate the walls immediately surrounding them. Beyond that, darkness remained untouched. The stone absorbed the light greedily. Corners dissolved into blackness only a few steps away. The shafts themselves swallowed illumination almost immediately, reducing the lamps to fragile halos suspended within overwhelming shadow. The smell of heated oil drifted softly through the chamber. Faint smoke curled upward toward the unseen ceiling. The priests stood in silence, gazing toward the narrow openings high upon the walls, their eyes reflecting the flickering gold of the flames. They did not see the shafts merely as architectural features. They saw direction. The pharaoh's soul, freed from the body through sacred rites, would ascend through these invisible pathways, not physically, not materially, but spiritually, cosmically. The shafts formed channels between worlds, linking the hidden heart of the pyramid to the eternal stars above. The journey upward was imagined not as flight, but as passage, a movement through darkness toward light, through confinement toward infinity. The symbolism was overwhelming in its subtlety. The soul began within the sealed chamber of stone, the domain of death, silence, and earthly stillness, and from there, through the impossibly narrow celestial corridors, it traveled outward toward the eternal sky, toward Orion, toward Sirius, toward divine permanence. The shafts themselves intensified this sensation because of their proportions. They were not grand passageways meant to inspire awe through scale, quite the opposite. They were constricted, oppressively so. A modern observer crawling through one would feel the stone closing inward almost immediately. The walls narrowed around the body with merciless precision. There was little room to turn, little room even to breathe comfortably. The air grew stale, the darkness deepened. Every movement echoed softly against the stone. Every breath sounded too loud. And yet, somewhere ahead, impossibly distant and impossibly small, a point of light waited. The stars. The psychological effect was extraordinary. To move through such confinement, while knowing the passage aligned not toward another chamber, but toward the open heavens themselves, created a sensation unlike ordinary architecture. The body felt trapped, compressed beneath monumental weight, but the mind expanded outward endlessly. The deeper one imagined the shaft extending, the more the pyramid itself transformed from tomb into mechanism, not a structure built merely to contain death, but to direct transcendence. The builders understood orientation with astonishing sophistication. The shafts were angled with careful awareness of the heavens as they appeared during a specific period in ancient history. The southern shaft of the king's chamber aligned toward the stars of Orion's belt at the moment they crossed the meridian, when Osiris stood at his highest and most powerful position in the sky. This was not casual symbolism. It was timing, precision, ritual architecture synchronized with celestial movement. The stars themselves became participants in the design. Night after night, Orion crossed above the pyramid. Night after night, invisible lines extended downward from the constellation into the hidden heart of the structure below. The pyramid waited beneath those stars like a silent receiver, and deep within it, the shafts pointed upward with unwavering certainty. The priests understood the sacred choreography unfolding above them. They tracked Orion's movement carefully. They observed Sirius rising in brilliant white radiance above the eastern horizon before dawn. They watched the heavens with the patience of those who believed eternity itself could be mapped. The stars were not decorative, they were destinations. The pharaoh's soul was expected to navigate among them. The cool air inside the pyramid seemed to preserve this belief long after the voices themselves had faded. Even centuries later, the chambers retained an atmosphere difficult to explain rationally. Visitors often described the silence as oppressive, almost alive. The darkness felt unusually dense. The narrow shafts inspired unease, not because they threatened collapse, but because they suggested purpose, a hidden intentionality embedded within the stone. One could stand inside the king's chamber and feel the enormous pressure of the pyramid above, while simultaneously sensing the open night sky beyond the shaft's invisible reach, buried and infinite, entombed and ascending. The contradiction lingered within every surface. The granite walls reflected faint traces of lamplight. Their polished faces glimmered softly in the darkness like black water. The air remained perfectly still. No wind entered here. No sound from the desert penetrated the chamber, only silence, ancient and absolute. And somewhere far beyond the stone, Orion continued its eternal passage overhead. The priests imagined the soul traveling upward through the shaft in silence. No violent motion, no dramatic ascent, only gradual movement through sacred darkness toward distant silver light. A vertical pilgrimage. The stars at the end of the journey did not blaze like suns. They shimmered softly, cold, steady, inviting. And perhaps that was the most haunting aspect of all. The shafts were too narrow for flesh, too precise for accident, too spiritually charged to dismiss as mere engineering. They seemed designed for something weightless, something invisible, something capable of leaving the earth without opening the stone at all. The pyramid no longer resembled a monument. It resembled an instrument, a machine built not for the living, but for the departing. The oil lamps flickered lower as the priests remained motionless within the chamber. Shadows stretched across the granite like liquid darkness. Above them, concealed within millions of tons of stone, the shafts continued their silent alignment toward the stars, toward Osiris, toward Isis, toward eternity itself. And in the oppressive stillness beneath the pyramid, another realization slowly emerged, quiet as drifting dust, yet impossible to escape. If the shafts were guiding the soul toward specific stars, then perhaps the Egyptians believed the afterlife was not hidden beneath the earth at all, but waiting somewhere in the cold and luminous architecture of the cosmos itself. The darkness inside the pyramid did not end abruptly. It loosened, slowly, like a held breath finally released into the open air. The imagined ascent through the stellar shafts, through stone, through silence, through the narrow corridors aimed toward eternity, gave way at last to the sky itself. The soul, once enclosed within granite chambers beneath millions of tons of stone, emerged into vastness, into cold air, into distance, into stars, and among all the lights suspended above the Egyptian horizon, one shone with a peculiar intensity, not merely brighter, closer, more intimate somehow, as though its light carried memory within it. Sirius, the great star of Isis. Before dawn, long before the first warmth of morning touched the desert, the world entered its quietest hour. Even the wind seemed to rest then. The dunes lay motionless beneath the fading night. Their curves softened into deep blue shadows beneath the last trembling stars. The Nile moved in darkness, invisible from the plateau, yet always present, its slow currents threading through the blackness like the pulse beneath a sleeping body. Moisture drifted faintly from its waters, cooling the air with a softness the desert rarely permitted. The priests waited during these hours, not speaking, not moving more than necessary, wrapped in pale linen that shifted gently with the breath of the pre-dawn wind. They stood facing the eastern horizon where the earth and sky dissolved into one another in shades of indigo and silver grey. The torches had burned low now. Their flames flickered weakly, no longer dominating the darkness, but surrendering to it. Thin ribbons of smoke rose upward and vanished almost immediately into the immense sky overhead. Everything felt suspended, waiting. The stars still remained visible, though dimmer now. Orion drifted westward slowly, descending toward the horizon with the unhurried dignity of something eternal. Osiris withdrawing into darkness once more, but attention had shifted elsewhere, toward the east, toward absence, because Sirius had disappeared. For weeks the great star vanished entirely from the night sky, swallowed by the overwhelming brilliance of the sun. Its absence was not interpreted as death exactly, but concealment, withdrawal, a sacred disappearance preceding return. The priests understood this rhythm intimately. Disappearance, silence, return, the cycle repeated endlessly. And each year, after the long absence, there came a morning unlike all others, the heliacal rising, the first reappearance of Sirius, just before dawn. The priests waited for it with extraordinary patience. Their eyes remained fixed upon the horizon, scanning the deepening blue where night slowly surrendered itself to morning. The anticipation carried a strange emotional weight, not excitement, not urgency, but reverence, a quiet awareness that something profoundly ancient was about to occur once more. The darkness thinned gradually, the horizon softened, and then a single point of light emerged, tiny, sharp, blue-white. For a brief moment it seemed almost fragile, trembling faintly against the brightening sky. But its light intensified quickly, piercing the final veil of darkness with startling clarity. Sirius had returned. The priests lowered their heads. Some closed their eyes entirely. Others continued watching the star with expressions so still they resembled statues carved from shadow and torchlight. The appearance lasted only moments before the growing dawn consumed it again. But those moments mattered because Sirius did not rise alone. It brought the Nile with it. Far to the south, beyond the horizon, rains had already begun to swell the great river. Waters moved northward slowly, gathering force, carrying fertile black silt through the arteries of Egypt, and when Sirius reappeared, the flooding followed. The river rose. The dry banks disappeared beneath dark water. Fields long cracked by heat softened once more into fertile earth. Seeds buried in dust awakened. The scent of wet soil returned to the air after months of dryness. Life began again. The connection between star and river became inseparable within Egyptian consciousness. Sirius was not merely observed, it was felt through the land itself. The heavens and the earth moved together in sacred rhythm, each reflecting the other with astonishing precision. Above, the return of light. Below, the return of life. And within this cycle lived Isis, not merely as goddess, but as presence. Divine continuity woven through the fabric of disappearance and renewal. The myth unfolded across the heavens themselves. Osiris descended into death, fragmented and hidden from the world. Isis searched tirelessly through darkness, gathering what had been lost, restoring what had been broken, breathing continuity back into silence. And just as Sirius vanished and returned, so too did life emerge once more from apparent absence. The symbolism was not abstract. The river proved it each year. The desert itself seemed to inhale differently when the inundation approached. The air grew heavier with moisture. Birds returned to the reeds along the Nile. The smell of wet earth spread slowly across the landscape, mingling with the mineral scent of stone and the sweetness of river plants awakening beneath the rising waters. Egypt breathed in cycles, and Sirius marked the rhythm. The priests understood this not as coincidence, but as cosmic order. The sky was not detached from earthly existence. The stars governed sacred timing itself. Their movements formed a celestial heartbeat, mirrored in the rise and fall of rivers, the growth of crops, the continuity of kingdoms, and the eternal return of the soul after death. Everything moved in circles. Nothing truly vanished. The pyramids stood beneath these cycles with immense stillness. Their stone surfaces caught the first hints of dawn, as Sirius briefly burned above the horizon. Pale blue light touched the edges of the structures, softening their geometry into dreamlike silhouettes against the awakening sky. For a few moments, the entire plateau seemed suspended between worlds. Night remained overhead, morning gathered below, and Sirius hung between them like a luminous threshold. The priests often performed rituals during these pre-dawn hours. Sacred oils shimmered faintly upon bronze vessels beside them. Incense smoldered slowly in shallow bowls, releasing sweet fragrances that drifted across the cool air. Myrrh, lotus, luteus, blue lily, the scents mingled with the damp breath rising from the distant Nile. Soft chants moved through the darkness, not loud, not forceful, but rhythmic and low, almost indistinguishable from breathing itself. The voices rose and fell gently, echoing the cycles they honored: return, renewal, continuation, the language of rebirth. The emotional power of Sirius rested partly in its restraint. It did not dominate the sky all night, like a blazing monarch. Its most sacred appearance came quietly, briefly, delicately, one brilliant spark emerging from darkness just before the world awakened. Hope arrived the same way, not violently, not suddenly, but softly, a single point of light persisting against immense darkness. The Egyptians built entire spiritual systems around this understanding. Death itself became cyclical rather than final. The soul disappeared only to emerge again in another form, another state, another realm of continuity. The annual flooding of the Nile reinforced this belief endlessly. The land seemed to die beneath the relentless desert sun. Vegetation withered, fields hardened into cracked earth, dust settled over everything. And yet, the waters returned, always. Black fertile soil spread across the floodplain once more. Green life emerged from what had appeared barren. The earth renewed itself beneath the guidance of celestial timing. Sirius became proof that absence was temporary. That silence preceded return. That darkness carried within it the promise of light. The priests watching the star before dawn were not merely astronomers, they were witnesses to resurrection. The horizon brightened slowly now, dissolving the last visible traces of Sirius back into daylight. But the disappearance no longer carried sorrow. The star would return again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next season. Its rhythm was dependable precisely because it vanished. Presence required absence, return required departure. The cycles gave meaning to one another. The desert temple beneath the heavens absorbed this understanding into every stone. The pyramids aligned themselves toward eternal stars, not because the Egyptians feared death, but because they believed existence continued through transformation. The soul ascended, the river returned, the star reappeared. Everything moved in sacred recurrence, and standing beneath the immense pre-dawn sky, watching Sirius shimmer briefly above the horizon before dissolving into morning light, one could begin to understand why the Egyptians saw the cosmos not as cold emptiness, but as a living architecture of renewal itself. The wind moved softly across the plateau now, carrying the scent of water from the Nile and the fading sweetness of sacred incense. The stars withdrew gradually into the growing blue of dawn, but their presence lingered, invisible yet enduring, like memory, like breath, like the certainty that somewhere beyond the brightness of day, Sirius still burned patiently in the darkness, waiting once more to disappear and return. The light of Sirius faded gently into morning, not extinguished, only hidden behind the brilliance of day. The priests understood this distinction instinctively. Nothing sacred ever truly vanished. It withdrew. It passed beyond sight. It traveled into unseen realms before returning once more in its appointed cycle. And so, even beneath the growing gold of dawn, their thoughts remained with the stars, with the invisible architecture suspended beyond the brightness of the sun, with the great celestial pathways through which the soul itself was believed to travel after death. The desert slowly awakened around the plateau. A faint breeze moved across the sand, carrying the cool scent of the Nile before the heat of day could erase it. Birds stirred somewhere along the riverbanks far below. The horizon brightened layer by layer, indigo surrendering to violet, violet dissolving into pale amber. But even as the earth returned to daylight, another landscape lingered within the Egyptian imagination, a hidden geography beyond the visible sky. The Duat, not hell, not oblivion, not punishment. The Duat existed somewhere between worlds, an immense celestial territory through which the soul journeyed after leaving the body behind. It was mysterious, yes, but not entirely frightening. The Egyptians did not imagine death as a plunge into chaos. They imagined it as passage, movement, a voyage across sacred terrain, and the terrain itself resembled something deeply familiar. For the Nile, too, flowed through darkness. Each night, as the sun vanished beneath the western horizon, the Egyptians believed it entered the Duat, traveling invisibly through the underworld before emerging reborn at dawn in the east. The journey of the sun became the journey of the soul. Both moved through hidden waters. Both faced darkness before renewal. The heavens mirrored the earth, and the earth mirrored the heavens. The river below had its reflection above. The stars themselves formed its banks. Night returned slowly over Egypt. The heat drained from the stones once more. Shadows stretched long across the desert, before dissolving entirely into blue-black darkness. The pyramids faded into silhouettes beneath the emerging stars, their sharp forms softened by moonlight and distance. And overhead, the cosmic river appeared. The Milky Way spread across the heavens in a faint luminous band, delicate and immense, like silver dust scattered across deep blue silk. It did not dominate the sky with harsh brightness. It shimmered softly, almost uncertainly, revealing itself only to patient eyes willing to remain still beneath the night. To the Egyptians, this celestial river was not abstract. It flowed. It carried souls. The duat was alive with movement. The priests, studying the stars from temple rooftops and desert plateaus, imagined the dead traveling through this dark blue expanse in sacred boats, drifting between constellations that served not merely as decorations of the heavens, but as destinations, gateways, warnings, and guides. The stars became landmarks upon an invisible map. Some regions of the duat shimmered peacefully, filled with cool starlight and gentle currents. Others concealed dangers, serpents coiled within darkness, gates guarded by ancient beings, trials requiring sacred knowledge to survive. But even these dangers did not transform the duat into a realm of terror. The atmosphere remained strangely calm, dreamlike, as though the soul, freed from the weight of flesh, drifted through a world where fear itself softened into reverence. The priests painted these celestial journeys upon tomb walls with extraordinary care. Long boats floated through star-filled darkness. Divine figures stood at their helms. Strange hybrid creatures emerged from the deep blue void, like fragments of dreams half remembered upon waking. Every image carried movement. The afterlife was never static. The soul traveled continuously, through gates, through rivers, through stars. The cool night air settled gently over the plateau as torchlight flickered near temple entrances. Sacred oils burned softly in bronze lamps, their scents rising into the darkness. Cedarwood, myrrh, lotus blossom carried faintly by the wind. The priests spoke quietly during these hours, their voices blended with the stillness rather than disturbing it. Even language itself seemed altered beneath the immense sky, softened by the awareness that every spoken word rose upward into eternity. Above them, the Milky Way stretched from horizon to horizon, the cosmic Nile, the river of the duat, and within its pale currents, the soul drifted onward. The Egyptians imagined death not as falling downward into the earth, but as entering this celestial geography. The stars became islands, constellations became kingdoms, darkness itself transformed into navigable space, the unknown became mappable. This was perhaps one of the most extraordinary aspects of Egyptian spirituality, the refusal to leave death undefined. They studied it carefully, they charted it, they gave names to its regions and rituals to its passages. The duat became an organized cosmos rather than a terrifying abyss. The soul entered darkness, but not loneliness. The dead traveled accompanied by gods, guided by sacred texts, protected by prayers and celestial alignment. Even the pyramids themselves participated in this navigation, orienting the soul towards specific regions of the heavens where divine continuity awaited. The stars were not passive, they received. The night deepened further now. The desert grew colder. Fine grains of sand whispered across the plateau in soft currents, barely audible against the enormous silence surrounding the pyramids. The stillness felt almost liquid. One could imagine drifting within it endlessly. And perhaps that sensation lay at the heart of the duat itself. Not confinement, not suffering, but floating, weightless movement through sacred darkness. The priests sometimes described the soul as becoming Ak, a transformed spirit, radiant with divine light. The earthly body remained behind, but consciousness continued, moving among the stars in luminous form. The idea carried immense tenderness. Death did not sever the soul from the cosmos, it reunited it. The Nile below reflected the stars upon its surface. At night the dark water carried trembling silver reflections downstream in slow hypnotic currents. Looking into the river became indistinguishable from looking upward into the heavens themselves. Above and below merged again. The Egyptians sensed this correspondence everywhere. The flood cycles mirrored celestial rhythms, the rising of Sirius mirrored rebirth, the daily journey of the sun mirrored resurrection, and the Nile itself mirrored the cosmic river flowing through the duat. Nothing existed in isolation. Every earthly movement belonged to a larger celestial pattern. The soul navigating the duat therefore traveled through familiarity as much as mystery. The landscape beyond death resembled transformed versions of what was already known. Waters, fields, boats, stars, horizons, but everything appeared softer there, vaster, more luminous. The edges of reality loosened within the duat. Time no longer behaved rigidly. Distances expanded and collapsed like dreams. The stars themselves seemed alive with intelligence, watching silently as souls drifted among them, and yet the atmosphere remained deeply peaceful. The darkness of the duat was not empty blackness. It was dark blue, the color of deep water beneath moonlight, the color of the sky moments before dawn, the color of sacred stillness. The soul passed through gates guarded by divine beings, whose names had to be spoken correctly. Sacred words became navigation. Knowledge itself became protection. The dead carried spells and hymns not as weapons, but as lanterns illuminating the cosmic river. The journey unfolded gradually, patiently, like the stars crossing the heavens themselves. The pyramids standing beneath this celestial map no longer resembled monuments to death alone. They resembled observatories of eternity, stone anchors connecting earthly existence to the living geography of the duat above. The shafts pointed upward towards specific stars because the heavens themselves formed roads. The pharaoh ascended because the cosmos contained destinations prepared to receive him. The soul traveled because the universe itself was structured for passage. Nothing ended. Everything continued in another form. The priests, standing beneath the stars, understood this with profound calm. Their rituals carried no frantic desperation to escape mortality. Instead, there was preparation, alignment, familiarization with the cosmic landscape awaiting beyond the visible world. The duat did not erase identity, it expanded it. The stars overhead shimmered softly in endless silence. The Milky Way flowed across the darkness like pale smoke drifting through eternity. The pyramids rested beneath it all, immovable and patient, as though listening to the slow breathing of the cosmos itself. And somewhere within that immense celestial river, the soul continued its voyage, past Orion, past Sirius, deeper into the luminous geography, hidden beyond ordinary sight. The desert air cooled further as midnight approached. The last torchlight flickered beside the temple walls before fading into embers. Above, the stars burned with ancient steadiness. Landmarks, guides, destinations, and drifting beneath them all, like a boat carried by invisible currents through an endless sea of dark blue light, moved the quiet and eternal mystery of the duat itself. And as the priests traced the pathways of the dead across the heavens, another possibility slowly emerged from the silence. Perhaps the pyramids were never built merely to honor the stars, but to teach the living how to navigate them. The stars alone were not enough. A soul could possess pathways through the duat. It could drift upon the celestial river beneath Orion and Sirius. It could move through the dark blue architecture of eternity itself. But movement required guidance, and guidance required words. The Egyptians understood something profound about language, something modern minds often forget beneath the noise of ordinary speech. To them, words were not merely descriptions of reality, words shaped reality. A spoken phrase could awaken divine forces. A sacred name could unlock hidden passageways within the afterlife. A prayer, recited correctly, became an action rather than a symbol. Language possessed weight, breath carried power, and within the silent chambers of the pyramids, those powers were carved into stone. The pyramid texts waited there for centuries in darkness, not painted brightly upon temple walls, exposed to daylight and ceremony, but hidden deep within sealed chambers where almost no living eyes would ever rest upon them. Their location alone transformed them into something intimate, secretive, sacred beyond ordinary ritual. One entered the chamber slowly. The air changed immediately. Coolness gathered around the skin with ancient patience, carrying the dry scent of limestone and dust untouched by wind or rain. The silence deepened step by step, until even breathing felt intrusive, softened instinctively by the immense stillness surrounding the walls. The torchlight moved carefully here. A single flame cast enormous shadows across the stone, causing the carved hieroglyphs to shift subtly as the light flickered. The inscriptions did not appear flat. They emerged from the walls like forms rising slowly from sleep. Birds, eyes, stars, reeds, serpents, hands lifted toward the heavens. The carvings possessed a strange rhythm even before they were translated. Their arrangement flowed with deliberate grace across the stone surfaces, forming visual currents that guided the eye gently from one sacred utterance to the next. The walls themselves seemed to murmur, not loudly, never loudly, but patiently, as though the chamber had spent thousands of years waiting for someone to speak the words once more. The smell of ancient dust lingered everywhere. Fine particles drifted invisibly through the torchlight, suspended in the still air like fragments of forgotten centuries. The stone beneath the fingertips felt cool and faintly rough, its surface worn softly by time, yet still carrying the precision of the original carvings. Every symbol had been cut intentionally. Nothing casual existed here. The pyramid texts were among the oldest sacred writings humanity ever created, yet they did not resemble philosophical reflections or historical records. They were active, functional, operational. They existed to do something, to protect, to guide, to transform. The pharaoh lying within the pyramid was never imagined as truly dead in the ordinary sense. He had entered transition, and the texts surrounding him formed a kind of spiritual machinery designed to ensure successful passage into eternity. The hieroglyphs became instruments, magical technologies embedded within stone. Some inscriptions addressed the gods directly. Others spoke to gates within the duat, commanding them to open. Certain spells protected the king from hunger, thirst, darkness, or destruction during his celestial voyage, but many carried a singular purpose above all others: ascension. Again and again, the texts returned to the same haunting image: the pharaoh rising upward into the heavens to join the imperishable stars. The translations themselves retained a strange poetic force, even after thousands of years. The sky has conceived you with Orion. You ascend from the eastern horizon of heaven. You are a star among stars. The phrases moved like ritual breathing, slow, rhythmic, hypnotic. Reading them aloud inside the pyramid chambers transformed the atmosphere entirely. The silence no longer felt empty. It responded. The walls absorbed the sound and returned it softened, elongated, ancient. The voice of the past awakened. The priests understood the importance of rhythm in these recitations. Sacred language was never delivered casually. The spells unfolded with measured cadence, each phrase balanced carefully against the next, allowing the words themselves to enter a trance-like flow. The pharaoh was instructed repeatedly: rise, ascend, become luminous, become eternal, become a star. The idea carried extraordinary tenderness. Death was not framed as imprisonment within stone, but liberation from limitation. The body remained below, wrapped in linens and oils beneath the immense weight of the pyramid, but the soul, through ritual, language, and celestial alignment, became radiant. The king transformed into light, into stellar permanence. The stars above Egypt no longer appeared distant in this context. They became populated by the dead, by transformed souls glowing eternally within the heavens. Orion was Osiris, Sirius was Isis, and the pharaoh himself joined their celestial company through sacred speech. The chamber surrounding the texts amplified this feeling of transformation. One could stand within the dim corridor, holding a small flame, and watch the hieroglyphs emerge from shadow in shifting patterns of gold and black. Ninetams. The figures seemed alive, not literally moving, but vibrating faintly with implied motion. Birds spread carved wings toward invisible skies. Serpents coiled around protective symbols. Tiny stars scattered themselves among prayers for ascension. The inscriptions transformed the chamber into a threshold, rather than a tomb. The smell of incense once burned there still seemed almost present, embedded somehow within the porous memory of the stone. Cedar oil, frankincense, the faint sweetness of lotus blossom lingering invisibly beneath the dust of ages. One could imagine the priests entering with slow, deliberate footsteps, carrying lamps that painted trembling halos across the sacred walls. Their voices would begin quietly, almost whispering at first, before deepening into rhythmic recitation. The spells were not read, they were activated. Each utterance became part of the pharaoh's ascent. The words themselves formed ladders. In some texts, the king climbs to heaven upon rays of sunlight. In others, he ascends by means of celestial stairways, or rises as a falcon into the imperishable northern stars. The imagery shifted constantly, yet the direction remained the same. Upward, always upward. The Egyptians feared forgetting more than death itself, to vanish entirely, to dissolve into silence without continuity, represented true annihilation. The pyramid texts resisted this fate through sacred remembrance. The king's name was spoken repeatedly, his identity reinforced through endless invocation. Language preserved existence. To be named was to continue. And so the inscriptions surrounded the pharaoh with eternal speech, ensuring that even in the deepest darkness of the pyramid, his soul remained addressed, guided, remembered. The stars outside continued their silent revolutions overhead, while the chamber remained motionless beneath them. Millions of tons of stone pressed downward with ancient certainty. Yet within that crushing stillness, the texts opened invisible pathways into infinity. A paradox lived inside the pyramid. The deeper one descended into darkness, the more intensely the language spoke of light. The narrower the chamber became, the more insistently the words described expansion into the heavens. The soul moved through confinement toward boundlessness. The priests believed pronunciation itself mattered profoundly. A sacred word spoken incorrectly could weaken its protective force. Names of divine beings had to be remembered precisely. The afterlife operated through knowledge as much as devotion. To know the names of gates within the duat was to pass through them. To know the names of stars was to navigate among them. To know the sacred formulas was to ascend safely. The pyramid texts therefore became maps, prayers, and mechanisms simultaneously. They instructed the soul while transforming it. They described the journey while actively creating it through ritual language. The chamber walls no longer resembled decoration. They resembled breathing scripture, and perhaps the most haunting quality of the texts lay in their intimacy. These words were never intended for crowds. They were not public declarations carved upon towering monuments for ordinary citizens to admire. They existed for one soul, one ascent, one eternal voyage. The pharaoh entered darkness, accompanied by whispers, ancient voices guiding him upward through the stars. Outside the pyramid, the desert night stretched endlessly beneath Orion and Sirius. Wind moved softly across the plateau, carrying fine currents of sand against the stone. The stars shimmered with cold steadiness above the silent structures. And deep within those structures, hidden beyond corridors and sealed chambers, the inscriptions waited, patiently, eternally. Even after thousands of years, they still carried the strange sensation of unfinished speech, as though the voices that once recited them had never fully faded, but merely withdrawn into the stone itself. The torchlight trembled faintly across the hieroglyphs. A carved falcon emerged briefly from shadow, a star, a ladder, an outstretched hand. The silence deepened once more, and from somewhere within that ancient stillness, the words seemed almost audible again. You do not perish, you rise. You become the imperishable star. The voice of the past no longer felt distant now. It had drawn close enough to whisper directly into the darkness beside you. And as the ancient prayers continued their endless murmur within the hidden chambers of the pyramid, another realization slowly began to unfold. Perhaps the Egyptians did not carve these texts merely for the dead to read, but for the stars themselves to hear. It begins, as so many ancient mysteries do, not with an answer, but with an impossibility, a kind of stillness that refuses explanation, a silence so precise it feels engineered. The pyramids do not announce their mathematics loudly. They do not proclaim their geometry in the way modern structures sometimes do, through visible grids, exposed steel frameworks, or deliberate aesthetic declarations of design. Instead, their mathematics is hidden beneath mass, buried within stone, absorbed into the very act of existence. And yet, it is there, unmistakably, relentlessly. The Great Pyramid of Giza does something that should not be possible when measured against the assumed limitations of ancient technology. Its sides align almost perfectly with the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, with a precision that feels less like construction and more like observation transformed into stone. Not approximate alignment, not symbolic orientation, but something far closer to exactitude. A deviation so small it dissolves into uncertainty when measured by modern instruments. So small that it becomes difficult to distinguish whether error exists at all, or whether human language simply fails to describe perfection at this scale. To stand at its base is to feel the weight of that contradiction. Because the structure is not small, it does not suggest precision through delicacy. It declares precision through magnitude. Millions of limestone blocks rise upward in stepped silence, each one weighing far more than a human body, many far more than several humans combined. The sheer physicality of it is overwhelming, stone upon stone upon stone, forming a shape that consumes the horizon with patient inevitability. And yet within that immensity lies something astonishingly subtle, a geometric discipline so refined that it appears almost reluctant to be noticed. The edges of the pyramid do not wander, they do not drift. They do not gradually betray imperfection as one might expect from structures shaped by hand, rope, wooden tools, and human judgment under an unforgiving sun. Instead, they hold with a quiet persistence that feels almost unnatural. The angle of each face converges upward with unwavering consistency. The base does not sag into irregularity. The corners meet with a kind of silent agreement, as though every stone, no matter how large or heavy, understands its position within a larger and invisible framework. The mathematics is not displayed, it is embodied. And perhaps that is what makes it so unsettling, because mathematics, in most human experience, is abstract. It lives in calculation, in diagrams, in written symbols traced across surfaces. It exists in thought before it becomes form. But here, it has become architecture. And not just any architecture. Architecture of staggering scale. Under the desert sun, the pyramid does not appear static. It appears almost alive in its interaction with light. The limestone surfaces shift subtly in tone as the day progresses, pale gold in the morning, blinding white at noon, soft amber in the late afternoon, and finally deepening into shadow as night approaches. But beneath this changing skin lies a structure that does not change. Not in orientation, not in alignment, not in intention. The mathematical precision embedded within it does not depend on visibility. It persists regardless of light or shadow, heat or cold, presence or absence. It is constant, and constancy, when scaled to this magnitude, becomes something difficult to comprehend emotionally. The human mind expects error. It expects drift. It expects the gradual accumulation of imperfection over distance. Even the simplest act of walking a straight line in sand becomes irregular when extended far enough. The body sways, the step shifts, the terrain resists uniformity, and yet here, thousands upon thousands of stones align with a coherence that feels beyond statistical expectation, as if the structure was not built, but tuned. The desert itself seems to participate in the illusion of simplicity. From afar, the pyramid appears almost minimal, clean lines, clear geometry, an elegant shape rising from emptiness. But as one approaches, that simplicity dissolves into overwhelming complexity. Ancient tools. Each block reveals its own character, worn by its own subtle irregularities before placement. Its own weight. The joints between them vary only slightly. Yet those slight variations become deeply significant when multiplied across the entire structure. And still, the alignment holds. It is here that the mind begins to slow. Because comprehension struggles against scale, the mathematics is not immediately visible like equations written on paper. It is embedded in spatial relationships that must be felt more than seen. One must walk the perimeter slowly, allowing perception to adjust, allowing the body to register the vast continuity of form. North remains north, south remains south. The structure refuses deviation, and this refusal feels intentional. The desert wind moves across the plateau in soft currents, carrying fine grains of sand that cling to skin, settle in fabric, gather in the creases of stone. The sun is relentless here during the day. Heat rises from the ground itself, distorting distance, bending perception, making edges shimmer as if the world itself is uncertain. And yet the pyramid does not waver within that distortion. It holds its geometry as though untouched by atmospheric confusion, as though reality bends around it rather than through it. This is where the silence of mathematics becomes most profound, because no inscription is needed to explain alignment. No voice is required to describe precision. The structure itself speaks through absence of error. It communicates through what is not present: deviation, drift, collapse of order. Instead, there is only consistency, and consistency, repeated across such scale, becomes something almost spiritual in its effect. One begins to feel the weight of invisible calculation, not equations written on stone, but equations embedded within stone. The mind tries to reconstruct how such accuracy could have been achieved. It imagines ropes stretched across vast distances, shadow tracking beneath the sun, observations of stars carefully recorded over generations. It imagines teams of workers moving in coordinated silence beneath blistering light, adjusting blocks by fractions of imperceptible degrees. Sweat would have soaked their bodies, dust would have filled their lungs, the sun would have burned without mercy across exposed skin, and still the alignment would have been checked, and checked again, not once, not twice, but endlessly. Because precision at this scale does not emerge from a single act. It emerges from repetition, correction, refinement, a slow accumulation of careful decisions that must resist the natural entropy of human limitation. One can almost feel it in the imagination of the construction site. The heavy silence of concentration, the absence of wasted motion, the focus required to move stone not merely into place, but into agreement with an invisible system of orientation that governs the entire structure. The mathematics here is not loud. It does not announce itself through symbols or diagrams. It exists in the relationship between mass and direction, between earth and sky, between intention and execution, and perhaps most strangely of all, it exists in the way the pyramid refuses to feel accidental. Even when one tries to reduce it to practical explanation, the emotional residue remains, because the experience of standing before it is not purely intellectual, it is physical, a sensation of scale pressing inward on perception, a feeling that the structure is aware of its own orientation in space in a way that transcends human expectation. The cardinal directions themselves feel different here, not abstract labels on a map, but real spatial forces that the pyramid acknowledges with quiet certainty. The north face does not merely point north, it belongs to north, it aligns with it, as though recognizing a pre-existing relationship. And that recognition feels almost reciprocal, as if the earth and the structure are engaged in silent agreement. The sun shifts slightly in the sky as afternoon deepens. Shadows lengthen along the stone, tracing the pyramid's geometry with slow precision. Each edge becomes more pronounced as light angles change, revealing subtle refinements in construction that might otherwise go unnoticed. Even erosion over millennia has not disrupted the fundamental order. The pyramid persists as a statement that resists time, and yet it does so without arrogance. There is no sense of proclamation, only presence, only stability, only the quiet endurance of mathematical order expressed in physical form. The silence surrounding it is not empty, it is saturated with intention that has long outlived its creators. And somewhere within that silence, one begins to understand that the true mystery is not only how the alignment was achieved, but how such alignment continues to feel present, even after thousands of years have passed, as though the mathematics has not ended, only paused within stone. And still, the question remains, not how in the mechanical sense, but why? Why this level of precision? Why this refusal of approximation? Why embed an entire civilization's labor into an orientation so exact that even millennia later, modern instruments hesitate to declare it imperfect? The pyramid does not answer, it simply stands, and in its standing, it continues to insist that the question itself is incomplete. Because precision of this magnitude does not feel like the outcome of convenience or necessity. It feels like intention elevated beyond survival. The desert around Giza offers no easy explanation. Sand stretches in every direction, uninterrupted, patient, indifferent. The horizon holds nothing that would demand such obsessive alignment. No natural landmark requires it. No river bends necessitate it. No mountain dictates it. And yet the structure behaves as though responding to something far more fundamental than geography. Something larger than the land itself. Something closer to the planet, or even the sky. The more one studies the pyramid, not as an object, but as a presence, the more the mind begins to drift toward the unsettling possibility that its geometry is not merely imposed upon the earth, but synchronized with it. As though the structure is not resting on the desert, but resonating with it. There are moments when sunlight becomes almost surgical in its precision. At certain hours, particularly when the sun is high and absolute, the edges of the pyramid appear razor-sharp against the sky. The joints between stones, those millions of carefully placed blocks, disappear into a seamless continuity that refuses to betray its construction. And yet if one approaches closely enough, the reality reveals itself again. Stone against stone, a join so tight that even a blade's edge feels too crude to enter it, not metaphorically, visually, physically. The seams between blocks are so refined that they challenge expectation itself. It becomes difficult to reconcile scale with detail, mass with delicacy. The stones are enormous, but the precision is intimate. It is here that admiration begins to fracture into disbelief, because the structure does not merely appear well built, it appears tuned, as though each block participates in a larger harmonic system that extends beyond architecture and into something closer to planetary coherence. The Great Pyramid's proportions have long drawn the attention of those who look for patterns within stone. Among its most haunting features is the way its geometry seems to echo mathematical constants that govern nature itself. Not overtly, not obviously, but like a whisper repeated across distance. The ratio between its height and base, when considered through certain interpretations of its original form, appears to approach relationships that resonate with pi, an irrational constant describing circles, cycles, and continuity without end. Meanwhile, its internal proportions and diagonal relationships have been said to reflect approximations of phi, the so-called golden ratio, found in spirals of galaxies, shells of living creatures, and branching systems of growth. These correspondences are not presented here as proof. They are presented as atmosphere, as unease, as the feeling that something within the structure seems aware of numerical harmony that transcends its immediate function. And yet the most unsettling aspect is not the presence of mathematics, but the absence of explanation. No inscriptions upon the exterior walls declare these relationships. No overt symbols announce hidden knowledge of universal constants. The pyramid does not advertise its mathematical resonance. It conceals it within form, within proportion, within relationships that reveal themselves only to sustained attention. This silence is important, because it suggests that whatever understanding guided its construction was not meant for display, it was meant for embodiment. The tools available to the builders, at least as far as conventional historical reconstruction suggests, were simple: copper chisels, wooden sledges, stone hammers, ropes, ramps, human coordination on an unimaginable scale. And yet simplicity alone does not explain refinement. Not at this level. Not when stone is placed with such consistency that even erosion struggles to reveal structural error. It becomes necessary, in the imagination of the mind observing this monument, to entertain a different kind of possibility, not necessarily mystical in the supernatural sense, but in the sense of lost perception, a way of seeing the world that allowed for precision without strain, measurement without fragmentation, an understanding of space that was intuitive rather than fragmented into isolated units of abstraction. The builders may have worked with tools we recognize, but perhaps they also worked with knowledge we no longer fully inhabit. Knowledge of orientation not as concept, but as relationship. Knowledge of Earth not as surface, but as integrated sphere. The pyramid does not sit passively upon the ground. It asserts alignment with it, as though responding to curvature rather than flatness, as though acknowledging planetary form in its very orientation. And this is where thought begins to spiral quietly inward, because once one accepts that the structure is precisely aligned to cardinal directions with near impossible accuracy, another implication begins to emerge beneath it. To align so precisely, one must understand not only direction, but the Earth itself, its rotation, its geometry, its subtle deviations, its invisible movements beneath perception. And if such understanding existed, then the pyramid ceases to be merely an architectural achievement. It becomes something closer to a planetary instrument, a fixed point of reference embedded into the surface of the world, a marker that does not simply exist upon Earth, but defines Earth through relationship. There is a moment, standing at its base in midday light, when the shadow of the pyramid stretches outward with perfect geometric clarity. It does not blur, it does not distort, it extends as a sharp-edged form across the sand, mirroring the structure above with exacting fidelity. The shadow becomes its own silent twin, a temporary geometry drawn not in stone, but in light absence. And yet even this shadow feels precise enough to be intentional, as though the pyramid casts not only physical shade, but mathematical presence. The desert heat intensifies during these hours. The air itself seems to shimmer slightly, warping perception at the edges of vision. Yet the pyramid remains visually stable within that distortion, its edges resisting atmospheric chaos with unsettling confidence. The mind begins to understand that what feels like stillness is actually control. Control of proportion, control of angle, control of how the structure interacts with light itself. Even the joints between stones participate in this effect. At certain angles, sunlight traces along their edges in such a way that they almost disappear entirely, creating the illusion of a single continuous mass. And then, with a shift in perspective, the joints reappear, precise, deliberate, unyielding. It is a kind of visual rhythm, a repetition of revelation and concealment, as though the structure refuses to allow itself to be fully seen at once. And perhaps that is part of its enduring mystery. The pyramid does not surrender its mathematics easily. It reveals them in fragments, in glimpses, in moments of alignment between observer and angle, between light and surface, between perception and patience. The longer one remains in its presence, the more the sensation grows that it is not simply an object being observed, but a system observing back, not in consciousness, but in coherence, in the way it holds orientation against the sky, in the way it maintains structural integrity against time, in the way it continues to express order without deviation. The builders, whoever they were in full historical reality, left behind more than stone. They left behind a condition of precision that continues to function long after its creators have vanished. And that is perhaps the most unsettling legacy of all. Not that it was built, but that it still works, still aligns, still holds, still reflects a mathematical discipline that feels larger than the civilization that produced it. As if the pyramid is not the conclusion of knowledge, but its surviving echo, a frozen articulation of understanding that once connected earth, sky, measurement, and meaning into a single unified perception of reality. And now, standing before it, the modern mind is left with only fragments, equations without origin, alignment without explanation, precision without accessible cause. The stones remain, the geometry remains, the silence remains. And within that silence, mathematics continues to speak, not in language, not in symbols, but in presence itself, a presence so exact that it still feels impossible. There are clocks that measure minutes, there are clocks that measure years, and then there are clocks so vast that human language begins to fail in the presence of their scale. Clocks that do not tick in seconds, but in civilizations. Clocks that do not mark the passage of a lifetime, but the slow unfolding of entire ages of humanity, rising and collapsing like waves against the shore of something far larger than memory. The sky above Egypt is one such clock, but it does not announce itself as a clock. It does not strike or chime or demand attention. Instead, it shifts, almost imperceptibly, almost cruelly slowly, a movement so gradual that no single human life can witness it directly, and yet so persistent that over centuries, over millennia, the entire architecture of the heavens transforms. This is the procession of the equinoxes, a celestial wobble, a subtle continuous, almost grieving hesitation in the Earth's axis as it turns through space. The Earth, in its endless rotation, does not spin with perfect rigidity like a flawless sphere suspended in mechanical precision. Instead, it behaves more like a slowly tilting top, its axis describing a vast, invisible circle across the sky, drifting through the constellations with a rhythm so slow it feels like the breathing of geological time itself. One complete cycle of this motion takes approximately 26,000 years. 26,000 years for the axis of Earth to complete a full celestial turn. 26,000 years for the pole of the planet to trace an immense circle among the stars. 26,000 years for the sky itself to subtly reorganize its identity above human history. And yet, within that enormous span, nothing appears to move in the immediate moment. The stars still rise, the stars still set, the desert still cools at night and burns under day. The Nile still flows with its ancient patience. Human life still unfolds in the familiar rhythm of birth, struggle, and disappearance. But beneath that surface continuity, something immense is shifting. Not violently, not dramatically, but with the silent persistence of cosmic inevitability. The sky is not the same sky that once looked down upon the builders of the pyramids, and yet it feels identical. That is the deception. That is the haunting subtlety of precession. The constellations we see today are not arranged exactly as they were when the pyramids were first aligned beneath them. The stars have not disappeared, nor have new ones replaced them. Instead, their positions relative to Earth's orientation have slowly, patiently drifted, like ink spreading through ancient parchment, submerged in invisible water, like the slow turning of a vast celestial dial, whose mechanism is too large to perceive directly. The effect is not immediate enough to disturb perception, but over millennia, it becomes everything. To stand in the desert at night and look upward is to participate in a fragment of this enormous clockwork without ever fully perceiving its scale. The sky feels stable, eternal, fixed. Orion still rises in familiar form. Sirius still burns with unmistakable brightness. The Milky Way still stretches like a river of pale light across the darkness. And yet, the alignment of these stars against Earth's coordinate system is not constant. It drifts. It shifts like something slowly remembering a different arrangement. The pyramid itself, with its precise orientation toward cardinal directions, becomes a kind of frozen reference point within this shifting celestial field. It holds a memory of the sky at a specific moment in time, anchored in stone, while the heavens slowly rearrange themselves above it. This is where the mind begins to stretch, because if the stars move relative to Earth's orientation over thousands of years, then any structure aligned with them becomes a kind of timestamp, a physical memory of the sky, a monument not only to architecture, but to a particular configuration of the cosmos that will never repeat in exactly the same way. The desert night deepens around Giza as this idea begins to take shape. The air cools slowly after sunset, carrying the faint mineral scent of stone, warmed and then released by heat. The pyramids rise in silhouette beneath a sky thick with stars, their forms unchanged, while the heavens above them continue their imperceptible drift. A wind moves gently across the plateau. It does not rush, it does not demand attention. It simply passes, brushing the surface of sand, shifting grains in soft patterns that vanish almost as soon as they appear. Even this movement feels subordinate to something larger, something geological, astronomical, almost indifferent to human presence. The stars above appear fixed, but they are not. They only seem fixed because the timescale of change exceeds the limits of ordinary perception. This is where precession becomes emotionally unsettling, because it reveals that stability is an illusion created by scale. What appears eternal is only temporarily consistent. The sky is not static, it is slowly turning itself inside a deeper cosmic architecture. Ancient observers, those who watched the heavens without interruption for generations, may have begun to sense this subtle drift long before it was formally understood, not through measurement alone, but through inherited observation, through the passing down of night sky knowledge from one lifetime to the next, each generation noticing that something was slightly different. A star rising a little earlier, a constellation shifting a fraction of a degree along the horizon, a celestial alignment that no longer appears in quite the same place it once did. These differences would not announce themselves loudly. They would accumulate, quietly, over centuries, until eventually the sky itself would feel like a familiar face seen after a long absence, recognizable, yet subtly altered in ways that cannot immediately be named. The idea that the pyramids might engage with such a slow-moving cosmic mechanism stretches the imagination toward its limits, because it implies that their builders were not merely tracking seasonal cycles or yearly movements of stars, but something far larger, something that unfolds beyond human continuity. A great year, a celestial cycle so vast that entire civilizations could rise, flourish, and vanish within a single portion of it, never perceiving the full arc of its motion. The Earth itself becomes a participant in this slow choreography. Its axis tilts gently as it rotates, and this tilt does not remain fixed in space. It traces a vast circular path, like the slow sweep of a cosmic compass needle across the dome of the sky. The stars that mark north are not eternally fixed, they change. Over thousands of years, the pole star itself shifts. What is considered the central point of the heavens is not permanent. It migrates through different stars, assigning cosmic importance to different points of light over vast spans of time. And yet human perception, bound to short lifespans, rarely registers this migration directly. It must be inferred, reconstructed, understood through accumulated observation. The desert sky does not reveal this truth in dramatic fashion. There is no visible turning wheel overhead, no sudden shift in constellation patterns. Instead, there is only the quiet accumulation of difference, night after night, generation after generation, century after century, until what once seemed fixed is revealed to have been slowly, inexorably moving all along. The pyramids, in this context, begin to feel less like monuments and more like anchors placed deliberately within a drifting system. Anchors not meant to stop motion, but to measure it, to record it, to survive it. Their alignment with cardinal directions becomes more than architectural precision. It becomes a statement about permanence within change, a fixed reference point against which the slow turning of the heavens can be understood. The desert itself becomes part of this silent measurement. The horizon line remains constant. The Nile continues its slow seasonal rhythm. But above it all, the stars shift their relationships with the Earth in a cycle too slow to perceive directly, yet too consistent to dismiss. The emotional effect of realizing this is difficult to articulate without falling into abstraction. It is not awe alone. It is not fear. It is a kind of temporal vertigo, a sense that time is deeper than experience, that what we call history is only a thin surface layer floating above vast, unseen currents of astronomical change. To imagine the sky as it appeared to the builders of the pyramids is to confront the possibility that they were observing a slightly different arrangement of stars than we see today. Not entirely different, not unrecognizable, but shifted just enough that the geometry of meaning changes subtly beneath interpretation. Orion is still Orion, Sirius is still Sirius, but their positions relative to Earth's axial orientation are not identical across millennia. They drift, slowly, indifferently, continuously, and in that drift lies the silent motion of the great year, a clock without hands, a mechanism without audible ticking, a cosmic system so vast that it can only be understood through patience extended beyond imagination. The pyramid, standing unmoved against the desert sky, becomes a kind of witness to this unseen passage. It does not participate in the drift. It does not alter itself to match shifting skies. It remains fixed in orientation, preserving a snapshot of celestial arrangement within its geometry, as though refusing to forget, as though insisting that one moment of cosmic order be preserved against the erosion of time. And beneath the desert night, as the stars continue their slow, imperceptible migration, the mind begins to sense something unsettlingly profound, that what we call the present sky is only a temporary configuration, and that every star above us is slowly, patiently moving toward a future version of itself that no human will live long enough to witness in full. If the sky is a clock, then the earth is its witness, and among all the witnesses carved into stone along the Giza plateau, none feels more patient, more unsettlingly patient than the Sphinx. It does not speak, it does not move, It does not interrupt the slow unfolding of celestial time with any gesture of urgency or reaction. It simply waits. Half lion, half human, half buried in sand and memory, it sits facing the eastern horizon, as it has for millennia, its gaze fixed upon the point where light returns each morning. And yet that gaze is not merely directed at the rising sun, it is directed at time itself. Because the Sphinx, more than any other structure in the Giza complex, has become entangled in a question that refuses to fade. Whether it was placed not only to witness the sky of its own era, but to mark a deeper moment within the slow-turning mechanism of precession itself. A moment some traditions call Zep Tepi, the first time, not the beginning of history as we define it, but the beginning of remembered order, the moment when heaven and earth were aligned in a way that later generations would regard as sacred origin. The idea lingers like dust in the air above the plateau, impossible to fully grasp, yet impossible to dismiss entirely. Because when one stands before the Sphinx in the late hours of the day, when the sun begins to lower and the shadows stretch long across the desert floor, there is a sensation that time itself is not linear here. It is layered, stratified, like sediment formed not only by sand, but by centuries of observation. The Sphinx faces east, always east, toward the rising sun, toward renewal, toward the daily return of light after darkness. But beneath that solar alignment lies a deeper, more unsettling suggestion, one that emerges not from direct evidence, but from the way the monument seems to belong to something larger than its immediate surroundings. The constellation of Leo, a lion in the sky, a celestial counterpart to the stone guardian carved into the plateau. And here, the imagination begins to stretch toward the edge of myth and astronomy intertwined. Because there is a theory, whispered through fringe interpretations, debated among scholars, and contemplated endlessly by those who stand too long beneath desert skies, that at a certain distant point in time, the constellation of Leo rose on the eastern horizon during the vernal equinox, occupying a position that would place it in symbolic harmony with the Sphinx itself. Lion facing lion, earth mirroring sky, stone mirroring constellation. And if this alignment truly occurred, then it would not be a passing curiosity, it would be a marker, a celestial signature embedded into the architecture of the world, a frozen correspondence between heaven and earth, preserved at the moment when the great year tilted its slow axis through a specific configuration of stars. The implications are staggering, not because they are easily proven, but because they suggest a depth of astronomical awareness that extends far beyond what conventional timelines assume. Did the builders of these monuments understand precession? Did they observe the slow drift of the stars across centuries and encode that knowledge into stone not as abstract theory, but as lived experience passed through generations? Or was this knowledge inherited from something even older, something now lost beneath layers of time so deep that only echoes remain? The Sphinx, eroded by wind and sand, carries within its weathered surface a kind of geological memory. Its body is softened by centuries of abrasion. Its features are worn, not sharply defined like modern carvings, but gently rounded by the persistent movement of air and dust. The desert has touched it endlessly, reshaping its edges with the patience only time can possess. Sand gathers at its base like a slow tide that never fully retreats. The wind moves across its face in quiet currents, brushing against stone that has already endured more seasons than any human history can comfortably contain. And through all of it, the Sphinx remains oriented toward the horizon, unchanged in posture, unmoved in attention, as though it is not merely a statue, but a point of awareness embedded into the landscape itself. The idea that it may have once faced a different sky, one subtly altered by precession over thousands of years, introduces a strange emotional dissonance. Because if the heavens above have shifted even slightly, then the Sphinx has been watching different versions of the cosmos without ever changing its gaze. It is as though the monument has been witnessing time pass not as sequence, but as rotation, a slow turning of celestial relationships above its unmoving form. And in that contrast lies something deeply haunting, the immobility of stone versus the mobility of the stars, the permanence of form versus the impermanence of alignment. The Sphinx does not chase the sky, it waits for it to return, or perhaps more precisely, It waits for it to complete its cycle. Because within the logic of precession, nothing is truly lost. The sky does not abandon positions forever. It returns to them across the vast arc of the great year. Constellations that once held significance will one day return to those same celestial coordinates, though not within the span of any single human civilization. This is where the emotional weight of the concept deepens. To think in precession is to think beyond memory, beyond inheritance, beyond cultural continuity as we normally understand it. This is the precession of the equinoxes, a celestial wobble, a subtle, continuous, almost grieving hesitation in the Earth's axis as it turns through space. The Earth, in its endless rotation, does not spin with perfect rigidity like a flawless sphere suspended in mechanical precision. Instead, it behaves more like a slowly tilting top, its axis describing a vast, invisible circle across the sky, drifting through the constellations with a rhythm so slow it feels like the breathing of geological time itself. One complete cycle of this motion takes approximately 26,000 years. 26,000 years for the axis of Earth to complete a full celestial turn. 26,000 years for the pole of the planet to trace an immense circle among the stars. 26,000 years for the sky itself to subtly reorganize its identity above human history. And yet, within that enormous span, nothing appears to move in the immediate moment. The stars still rise. The stars still set. The desert still cools at night and burns under day. The Nile still flows with its ancient patience. Human life still unfolds in the familiar rhythm of birth, struggle, and disappearance. But beneath that surface continuity, something immense is shifting. Not violently, not dramatically, but with the silent persistence of cosmic inevitability. The sky is not the same sky that once looked down upon the builders of the pyramids, and yet it feels identical. That is the deception. That is the haunting subtlety of precession. The constellations we see today are not arranged exactly as they were when the pyramids were first aligned beneath them. The stars have not disappeared, nor have new ones replaced them. Instead, their positions relative to Earth's orientation have slowly, patiently drifted, like ink spreading through ancient parchments submerged in invisible water, like the slow turning of a vast celestial dial whose mechanism is too large to perceive directly. The effect is not immediate enough to disturb perception, but over millennia, it becomes everything. To stand in the desert at night and look upward is to participate in a fragment of this enormous clockwork without ever fully perceiving its scale. The sky feels stable, eternal, fixed. Orion still rises in familiar form. Sirius still burns with unmistakable brightness. The Milky Way still stretches like a river of pale light across the darkness. And yet, the alignment of these stars against Earth's coordinate system is not constant. It drifts. It shifts like something slowly remembering a different arrangement. The pyramid itself, with its precise orientation toward cardinal directions, becomes a kind of frozen reference point within this shifting celestial field. It holds a memory of the sky at a specific moment in time, anchored in stone, while the heavens slowly rearrange themselves above it. This is where the mind begins to stretch. Because if the stars move relative to Earth's orientation over thousands of years, then any structure aligned with them becomes a kind of timestamp, a physical memory of the sky, a monument not only to architecture, but to a particular configuration of the cosmos that will never repeat in exactly the same way. The desert night deepens around Giza as this idea begins to take shape. The air cools slowly after sunset, carrying the faint mineral scent of stone warmed and then released by heat. The pyramids rise in silhouette beneath a sky thick with stars, their forms unchanged while the heavens above them continue their imperceptible drift. A wind moves gently across the plateau. It does not rush, it does not demand attention. It simply passes, brushing the surface of sand, shifting grains in soft patterns that vanish almost as soon as they appear. Even this movement feels subordinate to something larger, something geological, astronomical, almost indifferent to human presence. The stars above appear fixed, but they are not. They only seem fixed because the timescale of change exceeds the limits of ordinary perception. This is where precession becomes emotionally unsettling. because it reveals that stability is an illusion created by scale. What appears eternal is only temporarily consistent. The sky is not static. It is slowly turning itself inside a deeper cosmic architecture. Ancient observers, those who watched the heavens without interruption for generations, may have begun to sense this subtle drift long before it was formally understood, not through measurement alone, but through inherited observation, through the passing down of night sky knowledge from one lifetime to the next, each generation noticing that something was slightly different. A star rising a little earlier, a constellation shifting a fraction of a degree along the horizon, a celestial alignment that no longer appears in quite the same place it once did. These differences would not announce themselves loudly. They would accumulate quietly, over centuries, until eventually the sky itself would feel like a familiar face seen after a long absence, recognizable yet subtly altered in ways that cannot immediately be named. The idea that the pyramids might engage with such a slow-moving cosmic mechanism stretches the imagination toward its limits, because it implies that their builders were not merely tracking seasonal cycles or yearly movements of stars, but something far larger, something that unfolds beyond human continuity, a great year, a celestial cycle so vast that entire civilizations could rise, flourish, and vanish within a single portion of it, never perceiving the full arc of its motion. The Earth itself becomes a participant in this slow choreography. Its axis tilts gently as it rotates, and this tilt does not remain fixed in space. It traces a vast circular path, like the slow sweep of a cosmic compass needle across the dome of the sky. The stars that mark north are not eternally fixed. They change. Over thousands of years, the pole star itself shifts. What is considered the central point of the heavens is not permanent. It migrates through different stars, assigning cosmic importance to different points of light over vast spans of time. And yet human perception, bound to short lifespans, rarely registers this migration directly. It must be inferred, reconstructed, understood through accumulated observation. The desert sky does not reveal this truth in dramatic fashion. There is no visible turning wheel overhead, no sudden shift in constellation patterns. Instead, there is only the quiet accumulation of difference, night after night, generation after generation, century after century, until what once seemed fixed is revealed to have been slowly, inexorably moving all along. The pyramids, in this context, begin to feel less like monuments and more like anchors placed deliberately within a drifting system. Anchors not meant to stop motion, but to measure it, to record it, to survive it. Their alignment with cardinal directions becomes more than architectural precision. It becomes a statement about permanence within change, a fixed reference point against which the slow turning of the heavens can be understood. It is to imagine knowledge passed not through written record alone, but through repeated observation stretched across generations so long that the original observers dissolve into myth. And yet the pattern persists. Stars shift, but they return. The sky rotates through epochs like a slow-turning hearth, its silver embers rearranging themselves over incomprehensible durations, forming and reforming patterns that civilizations may rise to witness once and never again. The Sphinx, in this context, becomes something more than guardian. It becomes witness to recurrence, a fixed point within a moving sky, a stone consciousness observing celestial repetition without interruption. Nearby, the pyramids reinforce this impression. Their triangular forms rise in silent alignment beneath the same shifting heavens, their orientation unchanged, while the stars above them drift through their long, invisible cycle. Together, they form a kind of terrestrial constellation, anchored upon Earth, yet oriented toward a sky that refuses stillness. And here, the question returns with renewed intensity. If precession is so slow that it cannot be directly observed within a human lifetime, then how could ancient cultures have perceived it at all? How could a civilization without telescopes, without modern astronomical instruments, without extended written continuity across tens of thousands of years, come to understand a cycle that unfolds across 26,000-year spans? The answer, if there is one, does not present itself easily. It does not arrive as a neat conclusion. Instead, it lingers as possibility, a suggestion that knowledge in the ancient world may have been transmitted differently than we assume, not as isolated discovery, but as cumulative observation embedded within ritual, architecture, and oral tradition extending far beyond recorded history. A chain of awareness passed slowly through generations like a flame protected against wind, or perhaps something more unsettling still, that certain alignments in stone were not attempts to discover cosmic cycles, but attempts to preserve awareness of cycles already known. The Sphinx erodes slowly in the desert wind, but it does not collapse. It endures in partial form, its face softened but still visible against the shifting sands. Each grain that passes over it participates in a transformation, too gradual to perceive moment by moment, yet undeniable across centuries. Time does not destroy it quickly, it reshapes it patiently, and above it, the stars continue their slow migration through the great year, indifferent to human perception, yet inseparable from the patterns that ancient civilizations may have encoded into their most enduring monuments. The emotional effect of this realization is difficult to articulate without silence, because it places human life in a strange position, neither insignificant nor central, but momentary within a system so vast that meaning itself begins to stretch. To stand before the Sphinx is to feel that tension. Stone that outlasts memory, stars that outlast stone, and a cycle of celestial movement that outlasts even civilizations capable of building monuments to track it. The wind moves again across the plateau, soft, endless, unhurried, and the Sphinx continues to face east, toward the horizon where light returns each morning, as it has always done, not waiting for anything in particular, but simply holding its position within a sky that never stops slowly turning, a guardian not of a single moment in time, but of time itself as it moves through its silent, immense, and eternal rotation. There is a moment, standing between certainty and uncertainty, where history itself seems to hesitate, a pause, not in time, but in interpretation, a quiet suspension where two opposing worlds lean toward the same ancient monuments and see entirely different truths reflected back at them through the same weathered stone. On one side, the skeptical lens, measured, methodical, carefully restrained by the weight of evidence, probability, and reproducibility. On the other side, wonder, unruly, persistent, unwilling to let the monuments remain purely mechanical expressions of labor and geometry. And between them, the pyramids stand unchanged, as if indifferent to the argument unfolding around them. The academic perspective begins from restraint. It insists, gently but firmly, that human civilizations, even ancient ones, were capable of remarkable observation without needing to invoke lost technologies or hidden knowledge. The sky was always there. It was always observable. The stars always moved in predictable patterns across the night. Orion rose, Sirius returned, the sun traced its arc, the Nile flooded with seasonal rhythm. From this perspective, it is entirely reasonable, almost expected, that a culture so deeply attuned to celestial cycles would incorporate those patterns into its architecture, not as mystery, but as reflection. A civilization dependent on agriculture, seasonal flooding, and ritual timing would naturally develop an intimate relationship with the heavens. The sky would become a calendar, a clock, a symbolic language woven into the rhythm of survival itself. In this view, the pyramids are extraordinary, but not inexplicable. They are the result of sustained attention, collective labor, generational knowledge, and a culture that placed immense importance on harmony between earth and sky. No lost science is required, no forbidden mathematics, only patience, observation, and time. And yet, even within the calm precision of this explanation, there remains something that resists closure, because the monuments themselves do not behave like ordinary outcomes of gradual cultural development. They behave like statements so precise that they seem to demand interpretation beyond utility. The skeptical lens examines alignment data, architectural surveys, and archaeological context. It points to the ingenuity of ancient builders, the use of simple yet effective tools, the possibility of repeated calibration over decades of construction. It emphasizes human capability, not supernatural inference. It reminds us that precision can emerge from persistence. That complexity can emerge from repetition. That extraordinary outcomes do not necessarily require extraordinary assumptions, and yet, when one stands at the base of the Great Pyramid, when the scale is not abstract but physical, when the silence is not theoretical but surrounding, when the desert wind moves across stone that has held its position for thousands of years, the purely technical explanation begins to feel incomplete in a different way. Not wrong, but unfinished. Because there is another perspective that refuses to remain silent, the perspective of wonder. It does not reject skepticism outright. It does not deny the importance of evidence or the rigor of scientific interpretation. Instead, it asks a quieter question. What if the precision itself is the message? What if the alignment is not incidental, not merely a byproduct of careful engineering, but a deliberate attempt to encode something far larger than construction itself, something astronomical, something temporal, something that stretches beyond the limits of recorded history? The believer's gaze does not see coincidence easily. It sees correspondence, patterns repeating across scale, relationships that appear too consistent, too intentional, too deeply interwoven with cosmic cycles to feel accidental. This is the precession of the equinoxes. A celestial wobble, a subtle, continuous, almost grieving hesitation in the Earth's axis as it turns through space. The Earth, in its endless rotation, does not spin with perfect rigidity like a flawless sphere suspended in mechanical precision. Instead, it behaves more like a slowly tilting top, its axis describing a vast, invisible circle across the sky, drifting through the constellations with a rhythm so slow it feels like the breathing of geological time itself. One complete cycle of this motion takes approximately 26,000 years. 26,000 years for the axis of Earth to complete a full celestial turn. 26,000 years for the pole of the planet to trace an immense circle among the stars. 26,000 years for the sky itself to subtly reorganize its identity above human history. And yet, within that enormous span, nothing appears to move in the immediate moment. The stars still rise. The stars still set. The desert still cools at night and burns under day. The Nile still flows with its ancient patience. Human life still unfolds in the familiar rhythm of birth, struggle, and disappearance. But beneath that surface continuity, something immense is shifting. Not violently, not dramatically, but with the silent persistence of cosmic inevitability. The sky is not the same sky that once looked down upon the builders of the pyramids, and yet it feels identical. That is the deception. That is the haunting subtlety of precession. The constellations we see today are not arranged exactly as they were when the pyramids were first aligned beneath them. The stars have not disappeared, nor have new ones replaced them. Instead, their positions relative to Earth's orientation have slowly, patiently drifted, like ink spreading through ancient parchment, submerged in invisible water, like the slow turning of a vast celestial dial, whose mechanism is too large to perceive directly. The effect is not immediate enough to disturb perception, but over millennia, it becomes everything. To stand in the desert at night and look upward is to participate in a fragment of this enormous clockwork without ever fully perceiving its scale. The sky feels stable, eternal, fixed. Orion still rises in familiar form. Sirius still burns with unmistakable brightness. The Milky Way still stretches like a river of pale light across the darkness. And yet, the alignment of these stars against Earth's coordinate system is not constant. It drifts. It shifts like something slowly remembering a different arrangement. The pyramid itself, with its precise orientation toward cardinal directions, becomes a kind of frozen reference point within this shifting celestial field. It holds a memory of the sky at a specific moment in time, anchored in stone while the heavens slowly rearrange themselves above it. This is where the mind begins to stretch. Because if the stars move relative to Earth's orientation over thousands of years, then any structure aligned with them becomes a kind of timestamp, a physical memory of the sky, a monument not only to architecture, but to a particular configuration of the cosmos that will never repeat in exactly the same way. The desert night deepens around Giza as this idea begins to take shape. The air cools slowly after sunset. carrying the faint mineral scent of stone warmed and then released by heat. The pyramids rise in silhouette beneath a sky thick with stars, their forms unchanged while the heavens above them continue their imperceptible drift. A wind moves gently across the plateau. It does not rush, it does not demand attention, it simply passes, brushing the surface of sand, shifting grains in soft patterns that vanish almost as soon as they appear. Even this movement feels subordinate to something larger, something geological, astronomical, almost indifferent to human presence. The stars above appear fixed, but they are not. They only seem fixed because the timescale of change exceeds the limits of ordinary perception. This is where precession becomes emotionally unsettling, because it reveals that stability is an illusion created by scale. What appears eternal is only temporarily consistent. The sky is not static. It is slowly turning itself inside a deeper cosmic architecture. Ancient observers, those who watched the heavens without interruption for generations, may have begun to sense this subtle drift long before it was formally understood, not through measurement alone, but through inherited observation, through the passing down of night sky knowledge from one lifetime to the next, each generation noticing that something was slightly different. A star rising a little earlier, a constellation shifting a fraction of a degree along the horizon, a celestial alignment that no longer appears in quite the same place it once did. These differences would not announce themselves loudly. They would accumulate, quietly, over centuries, until eventually the sky itself would feel like a familiar face, seen after a long absence, recognizable, yet subtly altered in ways that cannot immediately be named. The idea that the pyramids might engage with such a slow-moving cosmic mechanism stretches the imagination toward its limits, because it implies that their builders were not merely tracking seasonal cycles or yearly movements of stars, but something far larger, something that unfolds beyond human continuity. A great year, a celestial cycle so vast that entire civilizations could rise, flourish, and vanish within a single portion of it, never perceiving the full arc of its motion. The Earth itself becomes a participant in this slow choreography. Its axis tilts gently as it rotates, and this tilt does not remain fixed in space. It traces a vast circular path, like the slow sweep of a cosmic compass needle across the dome of the sky. The stars that mark north are not eternally fixed. They change. Over thousands of years, the pole star itself shifts. What is considered the central point of the heavens is not permanent. It migrates through different stars, assigning cosmic importance to different points of light over vast spans of time. And yet human perception, bound to short lifespans, rarely registers this migration directly. It must be inferred, reconstructed, understood through accumulated observation. The desert sky does not reveal this truth in dramatic fashion. There is no visible turning wheel overhead, no sudden shift in constellation patterns. Instead, there is only the quiet accumulation of difference, night after night, generation after generation, century after century, until what once seemed fixed is revealed to have been slowly, inexorably moving all along. The pyramids, in this context, begin to feel less like monuments and more like anchors placed deliberately within a drifting system. Anchors not meant to stop motion, but to measure it, to record it, to survive it. Their alignment with cardinal directions becomes more than architectural precision. It becomes a statement about permanence within change, a fixed reference point against which the slow turning of the heavens can be understood. The pyramids align with cardinal directions, not just roughly, but with a precision that invites contemplation. The shafts point towards specific stars associated with mythological transformation. The layout of the Giza complex echoes celestial configurations that continue to inspire debate across disciplines. And when all of this is viewed together, not in isolation, but as a whole, the impression becomes difficult to dismiss that the architecture is participating in a conversation with the sky, not metaphorically, but structurally. The skeptic responds with caution here. It reminds us that humans are pattern-seeking beings, that we are neurologically inclined to perceive order, even where randomness may exist. That once a symbolic framework is introduced, Orion, Sirius, Leo, it becomes easy to overlay meaning onto structures that may have originally been designed for entirely different reasons. Coincidence, it argues, is not rare when viewed across large datasets. Given enough structures, enough stars, enough possible alignments, some correspondences are statistically inevitable. And yet, the believer listens to this argument and does not fully reject it. Instead, it deepens the unease. Because even probability, when stretched across the scale of the pyramids, begins to feel insufficiently precise to fully dissolve the mystery. It is one thing to say that coincidences occur. It is another to stand in a landscape where multiple layers of alignment, astronomical, architectural, symbolic, appear to converge repeatedly upon the same celestial references: Orion, Sirius, the cardinal directions, the horizon points of solstices and equinoxes, the subtle geometry embedded within sacred architecture, each one individually explainable, but collectively disturbingly resonant. The desert itself seems to amplify this tension. By day, it is harsh, measurable, almost brutally simple in its clarity. Stone and sand under direct sunlight reveal nothing hidden. Edges are sharp, distances are visible. Everything feels stripped of ambiguity. But by night, that clarity dissolves. The same landscape becomes uncertain, expansive, layered with invisible depth. Stars appear not as isolated points, but as structured fields of relation. The sky ceases to feel like empty space and begins to feel like organized memory. The pyramids, under moonlight, no longer resemble static monuments. They resemble instruments waiting for activation. And here, the debate deepens again. The skeptic walks through museum halls, cool, controlled environments where artifacts are labeled, categorized, and contextualized within carefully constructed narratives of historical development. Stone fragments are placed behind glass. Hieroglyphs are translated into readable explanations. Timelines are arranged into comprehensible sequences. Everything is orderly, contained, interpreted. The weight of history is distributed into manageable portions of understanding. But the believer steps outside that order and returns to the desert itself, to wind, to silence, to the feeling of scale that refuses containment. And in that space, interpretation becomes less stable because the monuments do not feel like fragments of a system. They feel like remnants of something larger than the explanatory frameworks we apply to them. The skeptic insists that ancient builders did not need advanced astronomical knowledge to achieve impressive results. Long-term observation of the sky, combined with practical engineering methods, could produce remarkable alignment without invoking lost civilizations or forgotten sciences. The believer replies, not loudly but persistently, that observation itself, when extended across centuries and embedded into ritual systems, begins to resemble something more than observation. It becomes transmission, accumulation, cultural memory refined over generations to a level of precision that modern fragmentation struggles to replicate. Neither perspective fully defeats the other. Instead, they coexist in tension, like two overlapping images that refuse to fully separate. The skeptic sees probability. The believer sees intention. The skeptic sees pattern recognition. The believer sees encoded knowledge. And between them, the pyramids remain exactly where they have always been, unmoving, unchanged, uninterested in interpretation. But the question grows heavier with time. If coincidence explains everything, why does the feeling of design persist so strongly in the presence of these monuments? Why does alignment feel not just correct, but meaningful? Not because meaning is scientifically proven, but because it is emotionally difficult to remove. This is where the debate becomes less about facts and more about perception itself. The weight of proof lies on one side, the whispers of intuition lie on the other, and neither can fully silence the other. Even in the most rigorous academic reconstruction, there remains a faint echo of something unresolved, a sense that the pyramids are not fully exhausted by explanation, that beneath the layers of engineering, labor, and historical context, there remains a dimension of purpose that resists complete translation into modern categories. And so the listener is left suspended between two forms of certainty that refuse to reconcile, one grounded in evidence, one grounded in resonance, both compelling, both incomplete, and the desert, vast and indifferent, holds them both without judgment. The wind moves across the plateau again, soft, patient, unchanging, and the pyramids continue to stand within it, as they always have, caught between explanation and wonder, between coincidence and intention, between what is known and what still quietly refuses to be fully understood. If the skeptical lens speaks in measurements, then the voice of lost knowledge speaks in silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of distance, like trying to hear a conversation taking place on the far side of a vast, dark valley, where the words arrive already softened by centuries of wind. And in that silence, the question begins to change shape. Because if the alignments, the proportions, the celestial correspondences are not coincidence, if they are not accidental byproducts of cultural curiosity, then they imply something far more unsettling and far more fragile. They imply inheritance, not invention alone, but memory carried forward from a deeper time, a time that no longer speaks directly, only echoes. The idea of a lost civilization has always lingered at the edges of human thought, like mist clinging to ruins at dawn. It is not a claim easily held in academic certainty, nor is it a narrative easily dismissed by imagination. It exists instead in a strange middle space, between archaeology and mythology, between probability and longing, a golden age. A moment in human history, or prehistory, when knowledge of the heavens was not fragmented into disciplines, but experienced as unity, when the sky was not merely observed, but understood as living structure, when time itself was not divided into manageable segments, but perceived as vast cyclical motion, returning, repeating, remembering itself across ages too large for modern memory to hold. And if such a worldview once existed, then the pyramids do not feel like isolated achievements. They feel like remnants, fragments of a much larger system of understanding that has since dissolved into the mists of time. The phrase itself, mists of time, feels almost too soft for what it describes, because it is not only forgetting, it is erosion. It is disappearance under layers of cultural sediment. It is the slow burial of knowledge beneath new languages, new priorities, new civilizations that inherit the structures, but not always the meanings behind them. Knowledge, in this sense, is not permanent. It is vulnerable, as fragile as dust carried by desert wind. And yet, paradoxically, when preserved in stone, it becomes the opposite, heavy, enduring, almost oppressive in its resistance to forgetting. The pyramids embody this contradiction perfectly. They are both message and silence, both communication and enigma, both memory and erasure. Because even if they preserve alignment with celestial systems, they do not explain their own reasoning. They do not come with annotations. They do not carry instructions for interpretation. They simply remain massive, geometrically precise, and linguistically silent. And so interpretation must travel outward from them, like light expanding through darkness. But what happens if the knowledge that created them was once part of a wider intellectual landscape that no longer exists? What happens if these monuments are not isolated miracles, but surviving fragments of a broader tradition of astronomical understanding that has since been lost? This is where the mind begins to wander through darker corridors of human memory, corridors lined not with certainty, but with absence. One thinks of the great libraries of antiquity, of the fragile accumulation of human knowledge stored in scrolls, tablets, papyri, materials far more vulnerable than stone. And among these vanished centers of knowledge, none looms larger in cultural imagination than the ancient library of Alexandria. Not because it alone held all wisdom, but because its loss has become symbolic of a larger vulnerability. That knowledge, no matter how vast, can be erased. Fire does not discriminate between myth and mathematics. Water does not preserve philosophy more than astronomy. Time does not protect insight from disappearance. The image persists, though historical details remain debated, of scrolls reduced to ash, of ink turning to smoke, of written worlds collapsing into silence. And even if the exact events are more complex than legend suggests, the symbolic weight remains unchanged. Something vast was lost, something irreplaceable, not necessarily in content alone, but in continuity. Because knowledge is not only what is written, it is what is passed forward. And when that chain breaks, even surviving fragments become difficult to fully interpret. In that sense, the pyramids feel like unread pages that survived the burning of a much larger book, standing intact but partially detached from their original context. Their meaning still present, but no longer fully anchored in the system that produced them. And so we look at them through layers of reconstruction, through academic interpretation, through astronomical modeling, through mythological frameworks, through speculative alignment theories. Each attempt brings clarity in one direction and opacity in another, like brushing dust off an inscription only to realize more dust settles elsewhere. The statues that once stood in temples and courtyards across ancient Egypt deepen this feeling of distance. Their faces are often calm, expressionless, but not empty. They carry a stillness that feels observational, as if they are witnessing something beyond the immediate present. Time has eroded many of them, noses broken, inscriptions faded, surfaces worn smooth by centuries of touch, wind and neglect. And yet they remain present in their silence, like witnesses who have long forgotten what testimony they were meant to give, but continue standing anyway. The mind begins to imagine what might lie beneath the surviving fragments of culture we have inherited. What systems of thought once connected astronomy, architecture, mythology, and mathematics into a unified worldview that no longer survives in intact form? Was there once a coherent framework in which the movement of stars, the flooding of rivers, and the construction of monumental architecture were all understood as expressions of a single underlying order, not separate disciplines, but interconnected expressions of cosmic rhythm? If so, then the pyramids are not anomalies. They are remnants of integration. But this possibility is difficult to verify, because the further one moves back in time, the more fragile the evidence becomes. Stone remains, but interpretation fades. Oral traditions shift, symbols evolve, meanings drift across generations like ships moving through fog without fixed navigation points. And so we are left listening for echoes, trying to reconstruct entire systems of thought from fragments of architecture and myth. It is like attempting to understand an entire language from a handful of surviving words carved into stone. Words without grammar, syntax without context, meaning without complete transmission. This is where the idea of a golden age becomes emotionally powerful, not because it can be proven, but because it offers a framework for imagining coherence in a world that now feels fragmented. A time when humanity may have once held a more direct relationship with the cosmos, when observation was not separated from meaning, when the sky was not abstracted into data, but experienced as living structure. And if such a time existed, even partially, even symbolically, then its loss would not only be historical, it would be existential, because it would mean that what we now struggle to reconstruct through telescopes, equations, and archaeological interpretation was once known in a more immediate form. Not necessarily more advanced in a technological sense, but more unified in perception. And so the pyramids begin to feel less like puzzles to be solved, and more like surviving instruments from a forgotten system of understanding. Instruments that still resonate faintly, even when their original operators are gone. The mists of time, as they are often poetically described, are not simply metaphorical. They are the accumulation of centuries of interpretive distance between modern observers and ancient creators, a distance that thickens with each generation, not because truth disappears entirely, but because context gradually dissolves. And yet within that mist, something persists, a gravitational pull toward the heavens, a recurring human impulse to look upward and search for order among the stars. Across cultures, across eras, across civilizations separated by vast distances in both geography and time, the sky remains a shared reference point, not identical in interpretation, but consistent in presence. A canvas of recurring fascination, a silent architecture above all human constructions. And the pyramids, whether interpreted as engineering marvels, ceremonial structures, astronomical markers, or symbolic monuments, sit within that shared impulse, like fixed points in a drifting field of meaning. To stand before them is to feel that we are not the first to look up, nor the last, but part of a continuum of observers trying to interpret a sky that changes slowly enough to feel eternal. yet changes nonetheless across spans of time too vast for direct perception. And so the debate continues between coincidence and intention, between emergence and inheritance, between reconstructed explanation and lingering intuition. But perhaps the deeper truth is not located at either extreme. Perhaps it lives in the tension itself, in the act of continuing to ask questions that cannot be fully resolved within a single framework, in the recognition that human understanding is always partial, always provisional, always positioned somewhere between what is known and what is still dissolving into mystery. The pyramids remain, the stars remain, and between them stretches a silence filled not with answers, but with the enduring possibility that some part of what we seek has been quietly waiting all along, not in certainty, but in the slow, patient unfolding of time itself. There are moments in every long journey, especially those that move through history, myth, and the slow architecture of time, when language begins to soften its grip on certainty, when words stop behaving like tools of explanation and begin to feel more like vessels for something quieter, something older, something that was never fully separate from silence in the first place. This is one of those moments, because after everything, after alignment and mathematics, after Orion and Sirius, after shafts carved into stone and texts written for ascension, after debates between coincidence and intention, after cycles of processions so vast they dissolve ordinary memory, the mind finds itself returning to a single image that refuses to fade, the Great Pyramid at dawn. Not as it is described, but as it feels when the first light touches it. The desert is still at that hour, not yet awakened into the harsh clarity of midday. The air carries a softness that exists only in the narrow threshold between night and day, when the world has not yet decided whether to remain in shadow or dissolve into illumination. And then the horizon begins to shift, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with a gradual unfolding that feels less like change and more like remembrance. The sky lightens first in subtle gradients of blue and pale gold, as though color itself is returning to the world after a long absence. The stars, still faintly visible, begin to retreat, not in defeat, but in quiet resignation, as if their presence has fulfilled its purpose for the night. And beneath them, the pyramids wait, still, unmoving, not as relics of a forgotten civilization, but as if they are participating in the transition itself. Then the sun appears, not as a disk immediately visible, but as a pressure of brightness gathering behind the horizon until it can no longer be contained. A slow emergence of radiance that seems to push the world into visibility. And when that first edge of light finally breaks free, it touches the apex of the Great Pyramid, just for a moment, just at the precise angle where stone and sky meet in a geometry that feels almost intentional beyond human design. The apex does not reflect the light like a mirror. It receives it, as though acknowledging it, as though recognizing it. And in that instant, the pyramid no longer feels like a monument resting upon the earth. It feels like a threshold between two states of existence, between darkness and illumination, between memory and perception, between the grounded and the infinite. There is something profoundly quiet in that moment that resists narration, because the light does not simply reveal the pyramid, it transforms it. The limestone surfaces, once muted in shadow, begin to glow with a soft, almost internal warmth. The structure appears less heavy, less anchored, as if the illumination is gently lifting it out of the weight of stone and into a different category of existence. Not solid, not symbolic, but transitional, a place where matter and meaning overlap without distinction. And as the sun rises further, the desert slowly awakens into detail. The sand begins to shimmer with increasing clarity. The horizon sharpens. The sky deepens into a vast, open expanse of blue that feels almost impossibly wide after the compressed intimacy of night. And yet, even as the world becomes more visible, something paradoxical occurs. It does not feel more defined. It feels more connected, as if illumination does not separate objects from one another, but reveals the invisible threads that have always linked them. The pyramids, the desert, the sky, the shifting air, all of it participating in a single unfolding presence that was always there, but not always perceived. And in this widening clarity, the mind begins to soften its sense of distance, Because the more one looks at the sky above Giza, the same sky that once guided ancient builders, priests, and observers, the more impossible it becomes to separate past from present entirely. Orion still rises in the night sky when darkness returns. Sirius still burns with unmistakable brilliance. The same celestial patterns that once anchored mythological imagination remain visible, unchanged in essence even as their positions shift slowly across the great year. And modern life, so often defined by speed, technology, and artificial illumination, does not erase that connection. It only overlays it. Satellites move across orbital paths invisible to the naked eye. Cities generate constellations of their own, electric, shifting, temporary. Screens glow with artificial stars carried in human hands. And yet none of it replaces the sky. It only coexists with it, because when the noise fades, even briefly, even accidentally, what remains above is still the same vast dome of darkness, punctuated by ancient light. And that light does not belong to history. It belongs to perception itself. There is something deeply humbling in this continuity, because it suggests that no matter how advanced human systems become, no matter how complex our technologies grow, the fundamental act of looking upward remains unchanged. We still look, we still wonder, we still search the sky for meaning that feels larger than ourselves. And in that sense, the modern observer is not separate from the ancient one. They are part of the same lineage of attention, the same quiet act repeated across millennia. To stand at Giza in the early morning light is to feel this continuity, not as concept, but as presence. The wind moves gently across the plateau. The stones hold their silence. The pyramids remain aligned with directions that still correspond to the earth beneath them and the sky above them. And for a brief moment, it becomes difficult to maintain the illusion that time is fragmented. It begins to feel instead like a single continuous field of experience unfolding at different speeds. The king's chamber, deep within the Great Pyramid, carries this sensation even more intensely. When light enters through the narrow passages, filtered, softened, redirected through ancient architecture, it touches the interior stone in a way that feels almost reverent in its slowness. Inside that chamber, dust motes drift through the beam of light, tiny particles suspended in air that has remained largely undisturbed for centuries. And in that suspended motion, something extraordinary happens to perception. The dust is no longer just dust. It becomes movement made visible, a quiet galaxy of particles turning slowly within a shaft of sunlight, as if the chamber itself contains a miniature cosmos, each mote catching light for a fraction of a second before fading back into invisibility, appearing, disappearing, reappearing again in endless, delicate cycles of illumination. It is difficult not to see symbolism in this, or perhaps it is more accurate to say, it is difficult not to feel meaning in it, because the image resists purely mechanical interpretation. It feels too intimate, too delicate, too precise in its fragility, as if the interior of the pyramid is not only preserving stone, but also preserving a relationship between light and matter that mirrors something far larger outside its walls. The same stars that drift above the desert night, the same cosmic cycles traced across the sky, the same slow turning of the earth beneath celestial motion. And suddenly, the idea emerges, not as conclusion, but as feeling, that perhaps the pyramid was never separate from this larger system. Perhaps it was always part of it, not an object placed upon the earth, but a point of connection between earth and sky, a fixed geometry through which human consciousness once attempted to mirror cosmic order in physical form. And now, standing in the presence of dawn, that idea does not feel like speculation alone. It feels like recognition, a quiet remembering of something not lost, but simply overlooked in the noise of modern perception. Because even now, in a world filled with data and analysis, satellites and simulations, we still respond to the sky in the same fundamental way. We still look up, we still feel small, and we still, in ways we cannot fully articulate, feel connected to what we see. There is a phrase often repeated in modern reflection: that we are stardust looking back at the stars. And in the context of Giza, beneath early sunlight and ancient stone, that phrase does not feel poetic in an abstract sense. It feels observational, almost literal. The same elements forged in ancient stars billions of years ago are present in the stone beneath our feet, in the air we breathe, in the structure of the body that looks upward. Matter that has traveled through cosmic cycles now experiencing itself from within, the universe observing its own continuity through the fragile lens of human awareness. And in that realization, something softens, not intellectually, but emotionally, a quiet easing of separation, as though the boundaries between observer and observed begin to dissolve, if only for a moment. The pyramids remain, the sun rises, the sky continues its slow unfolding into day, and beneath it all, something unspoken persists, a sense that this connection between stone and star, between past and present, between earthbound life and celestial motion, was never truly broken, only forgotten. And now, gently, through silence and light, it begins to return. There are endings that feel like closure, and then there are endings that feel like continuation, not because something remains unfinished, but because what has been understood no longer belongs to a single direction of time. It expands instead, softly, quietly, like breath returning to the world after a long silence. The pyramids, standing beneath the night sky, do not announce themselves as conclusions. They do not mark an ending point in human history. They do not close a story. They remain, as they always have. And in that remaining, they become something else entirely, not monuments to a past civilization, but anchors of a continuing presence, anchors of the human spirit, set into stone, yet oriented toward the stars. There is a strange comfort in this idea, that something built in deep antiquity, something shaped by hands that have long since returned to dust, still participates in the same celestial rhythm we observe tonight. The same Orion rises, the same Sirius burns, the same slow turning of the sky continues above the desert, as it continues above cities, oceans, mountains, and forgotten landscapes. And whether or not every alignment, every correlation, every interpretation is proven or disproven in the strict language of academic certainty, it does not erase what these structures have become in the human imagination. Because meaning is not only constructed through verification, it is also constructed through resonance, through what persists in thought long after explanation has ended. The Orion correlation, the stellar shafts, the duat, the pyramid texts, the idea of cosmic cycles too vast to be directly perceived. All of it now exists, not only in archaeological debate, but in something quieter and more enduring, a shared sense of wonder, a feeling that human life has always been in conversation with something larger than itself. And so the pyramids remain, not as answers, but as questions that refuse to disappear. In the distant future, far beyond the span of our current civilizations, beyond the rise and fall of languages, beyond the erosion of empires yet to come, the desert will still exist, the sands will shift, the Nile will continue its slow journey toward the sea, and the pyramids will still stand, their alignment unchanged, their geometry still intact, their presence still visible beneath a sky that will have shifted through yet more phases of the great year. New stars will have taken positions of importance. Old constellations will have drifted into different regions of the sky. Civilizations yet unborn will look upward and see patterns we cannot yet imagine. And still, the pyramids will be there, silent, patient, unmoved by the passage of time that reshapes everything around them. And perhaps at that distant moment, some future consciousness, whether human or something beyond our current understanding, will stand where we once stood, and they will ask the same questions. Who built this? Why does it align this way? What did they know of the stars? And in that repetition of wonder across time, something essential is revealed, that curiosity itself is a kind of inheritance. The stars will turn, the sands will shift, the silence will remain, and still, beings who look upward will ask what it means to be beneath such a sky. The pyramids, in this sense, are not simply structures of stone. They are echoes made physical. Echoes of a question that humanity has never stopped asking. Where do we belong in the vast architecture of the cosmos? And the answer, if there is one, does not arrive as statement. It arrives as feeling. A sense that belonging is not something granted from above or below, but something shared across all things that exist within the same unfolding universe. Stone belongs to the earth, light belongs to the stars, and human consciousness, fragile and temporary, belongs somewhere in between, able to witness both, able to reflect upon both, able to stand at the threshold between matter and meaning. The Nile continues its ancient flow, but in imagination, it becomes something more than a river of water. It becomes a river of time, a current that carries not only sediment and life, but memory itself. And in that imagined flow, the soul of the pharaoh rises, not as myth alone, but as metaphor for transformation, traveling through darkness, passing through celestial thresholds, ascending toward the region of Orion, where myth and astronomy converge into a single luminous idea, that death is not disappearance, but return. Return to the sky, return to pattern, return to the vast, silent order that predates individual existence and outlasts it without effort. The belt of Orion hangs above the horizon, steady in its ancient configuration, unchanged in essence even as the Earth continues its slow axial drift through the great year. And in that belt of stars, imagination places the final resting point of a journey that began in dust and light, not as an ending of identity, but as reintegration into something larger, something continuous, something unbroken. And beneath it all, the Great Pyramid begins to feel less like a structure and more like a threshold dissolving into perception. Its edges soften in the darkness. Its stone loses the sharpness of form. Its mass seems to merge with the night itself, until it is no longer clearly separate from the sky above it. Stone becomes shadow, shadow becomes starlight, and starlight becomes continuity, as though the monument was never meant to remain isolated from the heavens, but always intended to participate in their quiet transformation. The stars will turn, the sands will shift, the silence will remain, and the human gaze, always returning, always searching, will continue to lift itself upward into the vast unknown, finding in that darkness not emptiness, but belonging. A final stillness settles over the imagined landscape of Giza, not an ending, not a disappearance, but a release, like a massive stone door closing not in confinement, but in peace. And as it closes, there is no fear within it, only recognition that everything observed, every alignment, every myth, every question, every silence, has always been part of the same single, unfolding presence. The universe remembering itself through light, through stone, through time, through us. And somewhere in that infinite return, where all paths curve gently back into the sky from which they began, there is only one thing left to understand, that we were never looking at the stars from below. We were always already among them. And then, there is only silence.